Through power I gain victory. Failing that, the Alliance commander was prepared to sacrifice herself in an attempt to stop the superweapon from snuffing out all life allies and enemies alike on Iyakath. What she wasn't prepared for, as if her uncharacteristically selfless, borderline suicidal plan couldn't backfire spectacularly, as if they weren't on a planet littered with astonishing technological feats, was ending up in stasis for an impossible amount of time. When the apex predators of two eras clash, who shall prevail and at what cost? Do whatever it takes. In the meantime, tell our forces to take shelter. Zaethris Vescure immediately headed for the door upon hearing the grave assessment of the situation, amber flames dancing in her eyes. At the door, she half turned towards her two advisors and, in a quieter voice, added, "Be safe both of you." As she continued walking through the complex in powerful strides, without looking at any member of the Alliance in particular, she barked, "Notify Major Pierce and Major Quinn to meet me at the shuttle platform without delay. Make sure Quinn gets a fully equipped medkit." If this truly was to be her last act as Alliance commander, there was nobody she'd rather have at her side than those two men. Nobody else could be trusted to bear the burden. Number. The silence stretched on even after the cramped shuttle had taken off. In contrast to Quinn's ramrod straight posture, pale face schooled into a neutral mask in an unsuccessful attempt to hide his desperation to look anywhere but at the commander, Piers sat hunched over, expression dark and expectant. As the landing platform of a smaller part of the control complex slowly came into view, the commander stopped her seething and addressed the two officers. "You got the briefing?" "Yeah, pub's messed up big time. Superweapon's gonna blow up any moment, killing everyone." Pierce gave a rather crude, though certainly not incorrect, summary of the situation. "Quite so, however slight the chance. I shall attempt to stop it by taking control of the weapon via one of the thrones. Given what happened to Supreme Commander Malcolm, it's not going to be pleasant." She took a steadying breath. "In fact, it appears highly unlikely I will survive." "Quinn, it's your job to improve my odds." Their eyes locked in understanding. "I have little intention of sacrificing myself. But if it turns out I am too weak to vanquish this technological abomination, well, philosophical reservations aside, the last resort will be blowing the throne up. Perhaps the weapon has an inbuilt safety routine, assuming there are no other means of control left. That will be your part, Pierce." She nodded towards the crate of explosives. "Lord, while you're and we I mean, at close quarters, that would kill. If the weapon activates, that point is moot. I am acutely aware of what I am asking of you. If you're not capable, it's not a matter of being capable." The Sith held up her hand. "Will you follow my orders, Pierce?" Without hesitation. "Good. I knew I can rely on you in all situations." She turned towards Quinn. "Any objections?" "No, Millard. The plan is sound given the circumstances, though I wish it offered an alternative to the dire prospect of you dying." "Well, I am counting on you to keep me alive." She gave him a small smile that was probably meant to be comforting, though it only worsened the creeping sense of dread that had settled in Quinn's chest. Upon disembarking, he felt a massive hand on his shoulder, giving him a painful squeeze. "So, no pressure, Major. Don't criff this up." There was a degree of pain resignation hidden behind the younger officer's sly grin that alluded to their strained relationship. Number. Given the opportunity to run the necessary calculations, his worst-case scenario would have looked exactly like the unfolding situation. Their chances were rapidly diminishing, as the commander's vitals plummeted despite Quinn's best efforts. It took all of his willpower not to panic. Seeing the former Empire's wrath, one of the galaxy's most powerful being, the woman he loved loves, thrashing on the throne, blood trickling from her nose and a veil of tiny dark veins framing her eyes, broke something in him. Her strained grunts had long turned into tortured wailing, before her voice suddenly faded. "I can't," she ground out. "Artyom." That was Pierce's personal name, Quinn mused, momentarily taken aback by the implied, intimacy. He had never heard Wrath use that name, while they'd both served under her command. In fact, even after their marriage, she had rarely called him Malavai, usually preferring his rank or family name even in bed, perhaps out of habit. A half-ironic wink at his sense of propriety. Or had it been a conscious choice to put distance between them as a subtle token of continual reproach? It was strange and outright shameful that he never learned to really understand her true way of thinking in personal matters. If only there had been more time. Quinn winced. He could not afford to be distracted at such a critical point. Then the realization set in, like a serrated knife languidly dragged over his chest. She'd given Pierce the signal to trigger the explosives. Mind racing, Quinn took one last look at her vitals. But all he saw was critical oxygen levels, ridiculously abnormal brain waves, and an unsustainably high heart rate. No miracle had occurred while he had irresponsibly dwelled on the past. and what he might have failed to notice back then. There was no fortuitous salvation for a worthless man like him. Nothing could exculpate his abject failure. Focusing on the commander's face contorted in agony, as if to punish himself once more at the very end, he braced himself for the detonation. It never came. As the seconds ticked away, confusion was replaced by resolve. Whatever was keeping Pierce from criffing following orders, he would finish this. He would not fail his lord again. He rounded the throne with quick strides and stopped abruptly in his tracks. Pierce's unconscious form was splayed on the floor. Next to him, the commander's advisor was kneeling in front of a small panel and fiddled with the throne's wiring. Quinn's hand slid to his blaster. "Stop. This is not what it looks like," the former CIS agent murmured placatingly. But he kept working nonetheless. They were losing too much dang at time. Hands off the wiring. Quinn grew impatient. He had no doubt that Shan had knocked the younger officer out, but why would he sabotage his commander's efforts to save them all? "Look, Major, we can discuss this later. This is the only way to." At the faint click of a safety lever, Shan's head jerked up, eyes wide. "Step back, now," Quinn all but yelled. Both men stared at each other for a moment. Then Quinn noticed the telltale minute twitching of the advisor's pupils. Mental slicing. Pathetic cis-worm. Traitor, the Imperial officer hissed and pulled the trigger. At the exact same time, a tremor from the throne shook the platform, causing the shot to miss and allowing Shan to tumble out of harm's way, behind Quinn, who yelped in surprise as his legs were kicked out from under him. They grappled on the floor, both clearly trained in hand-to-hand combat. After a short but vicious struggle, Shan managed to gain the upper hand, putting his opponent in a side choke. Quinn's vision blurred as a suffocating heat crept up his chest, setting his face ablaze. "Will you just let me finish?" the traitor panted, straining to keep Quinn from slipping out of his chokehold. His efforts to continue the slicing with the aid of his implants sufficiently distracted him from noticing his opponent's fingers edging towards the triggering device. As he felt the comfortingly cold plastoid of the button under his fingertips, Quinn squeezed his eyes shut and awaited the scorching darkness as his consciousness faded. Lights flickering, fading, re-emerging from within, crushing her under waves, under shadows, lights blinding, searing her skin, a tentative breath, numbness, silence pounding in her ears. "Make sure the tribute lives. We can't afford to disappoint our new allies." Bony, pallid faces came too close, detached eyes examined her, motionless, helpless, weak. Their vaguely humanoid features blended with the distorted head of the machine god that had lured her into this mess in the first place, provided that was an actual memory, and not another figment of her decaying synapses. Raise your bloodied fist and cry triumph. Number. She was finally dying. That was the most likely explanation, if the corroding pain that seemed to be literally everywhere at once was any indication. Though it was peculiar, to say the least, that her life would indeed end hallucinating lying in damp, badly lit cavern, the worried face of a middle-aged human male in GD robes hovering over her. Well, it wasn't as if she expected anything but cruel irony from the Force, given how weak she'd apparently allowed herself to get. The dark side was a way to immense power, but truly harnessing it without succumbing to it was, in her experience, a path requiring a steady stream of sacrifices, a path suitable only for the strongest. The dark was greedy and could only take, never give, unless you violently ripped what you want out of the Force, and thus proved your worth. Unchecked, it would creep into the tiniest cracks in one's control, latch onto the smallest weaknesses, and devour one from within. And that was why any weakness had to purged, and also why a fallen GD was usually so much worse than a Sith. Their previous training had simply not equipped them with the means to subjugate the Force. Instead, they just gave themselves to the dark, naively inviting it in to erode them from the inside out, under the guise of giving them freedom to follow all their desires. Case in point, Jisa. But that one had been the master's failing as much as the apprentice's, if Saithris was honest. It hurt, in a bad way, and that was not something she could afford feeling right now. It wasn't the first time that she dreamt of random GD lecturing her in various ridiculous settings, either, though this one seemed much more corporeal, if oddly unkempt in appearance. Hardly the paragons of the lighter mind had conjured up so far. The new face spoke, or rather, its lips kept moving, almost hypnotically, but Zaithris as per usual decided to ignore the platitudes it had to offer, empty words dripping with the altruistic concern that was the GD's favorite self-deception. This way, the antics of the man were almost comical. To her surprise, when she squeezed her eyes shut, her surroundings disappeared, however temporarily. She hadn't been able to look away before, even when the surreal imagery had become almost too much to bear. In a complete departure from previous renditions of similar illusionary situations, something in fact, everything felt off. Perhaps, this time, she should listen for a change. Messing with the GD in her lucid dying dreams was getting boring anyway. Are you in pain? The GD asked tentatively. Your prattling is giving me a headache. Thank the force, you're awake. I was beginning to fear the worst. He seemed undeterred by her jibe. I do apologize for the talking. I tried to guide you back to consciousness. I am not a healer. So well, I guess it worked. Seeing as you are awake. But I didn't do a particularly good job. I don't think it's supposed to hurt. The disheveled man shrugged awkwardly. Unfortunately, I have run out of medical supplies. Last one to leave the ship, so to speak. Ship. She half expected their surroundings to change in order to fit the new narrative her pain-addled mind had come up with. Figuratively speaking, it's a, convoluted story. She took a steadying breath. Stuck in the cave, then. On the off chance that this was real, what exactly was real nowadays? Anyway, she had better take precautions. It took hardly any conscious effort to sustain the technique she'd learned from Darth Mar and Satel Shan. A kind of meditation with useful side effects for precisely that kind of situation, but actively reaching into the force made her want to throw up. Carbonite sickness. I am not pressed for time, she remarked after the nausea had subsided. I can imagine you will need time to recover from whatever you've gone through. But as a matter of fact, we urgently need to get going. I have delayed the others long enough, though the time certainly wasn't wasted, considering that I happened upon you. Lucky me. Zaithras snorted, still unsure where this was going. She decided to humor the stranger, and slowly pushed herself to a standing position. Consciously feeling her feet was somewhat disorienting. It did not take long for the odd sensation to fade, and for her surrounding to stop swaying. Well, then, lead the way. You might need clothing. She looked down only to realize that she was stark naked. Well, that explains why you looked everywhere but at my body. I was beginning to feel insulted. He gave a wry smirk. I am a GD after all. So you're a eunuch. Zaithras returned the smile, a little more feral. No, I meant, he floundered, that we GD excel at self-control. Sure, whatever helps you sleep. With reluctance, she wrapped herself in the proffered dull, dark brownish cloak, and decided not to dwell on the pathetic image she presented. Number. I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you get down here? How did you? Zaithras shot back, struggling to keep up the pace as they scrambled over the rocks. Fair point. I should have introduced myself. Atreus Vakin, GD archivist. Aren't you quite far out of your comfort zone? As a librarian, she stopped to catch her breath, get a dang grip, and gestured around them. I lead the excavation efforts here on Farnas 2. This place has a rich history. Various groups of colonists settled here throughout the ages. We hope to find signs of the original population below these mines. We were so close to a breakthrough. He threw his hands down in exasperation. These brutes will raise everything. What happened? The Farnasi chose to ally with the separatists, which instantaneously sparked a civil war because of course not everyone agreed with that decision. The ground dwellers, that's the ones living down here in the mines, were never in favor of siding with the Republic. They're a fascinating group. Rather superstitious, hardworking, claim their forefathers were the original inhabitants chosen as a superior people by visiting advanced aliens millennia ago. But alas, they are also easy to impress with displays of power. Whereas the city dwellers were always happy to be part of the Republic trade network. Actually, they're the same species despite their physical differences, but don't mention that to their faces or either side will try to lynch you. The council was supposed to send someone to negotiate, but I am not sure what outcome they've reached, if any, or if they actually ever arrived here. Let's just hope the situation on the ground hasn't deteriorated to the point that we can't get safe passage to the shuttles. I sent the other researchers ahead. I couldn't just leave my research like that. The separatists are here for the resources rather than the culture. When I tried to follow my people later, the main access route was blocked. So I had to find an alternative path. My short-sightedness might have doomed them all if they decided to wait for me. Can you imagine the hubris? She could easily. It was a GD she was dealing with, after all. My only comfort is that I found you along the way. I shudder to think what might have been your fate otherwise. He turned around fully to look at her quizzically. You didn't know anything about the events outside. How long did they keep you in that shrine? None of the GD's ridiculously detailed descriptions of Criffing local history, and what was surely inconsequential politicking in a backwater, formerly Republic system she'd never even heard of made much sense to her. Worse still, there was no plausible explanation for her presence of a completely different planet or had she imagined Ayakath too. Although a shrine, I guess you didn't go willingly. Stars, these traditionalists are more savage than I thought. They didn't tell you anything, did they? He gave her a pitying look. Zayathris suppressed the urge to choke that sentiment out of him. No need to rub it in, Jidi. They have a custom of offering tributes, usually not people. Thank the Force to new arrivals. Makes sense, given their colonial history, to placate the newcomers. But if they left without finishing the preparations, his shoulders sagged. That means a total cluster freak awaits us outside. It would seem so. Let's not delay. We are close to the surface, just 2 levels to go. Climbing a pile of dewback-sized, sharp rocks that cut our shins in several places, took them to a massive man-made cavern. Far more sophisticated than the small. A pity most of it had collapsed into even more huge piles of rubble, including the ceiling in one place, giving view to a bright orange sky that cast a ghastly hue over the hall. They made their way across the room and were nearly at the opening when the Jedi suddenly stiffened. Oh no, he gasped almost inaudibly, a violent shiver running through his body. Why was Emperor's balls? She was losing her touch. How could she have missed that presence? Another mistake like that and she'd be dead. She cautiously turned around to see a bearded elderly man approaching them. His dark aura was remarkably understated, but it enclosed them like a vise nonetheless. Are you lost, my Jedi friend? His deep voice reflected off the walls, immersing them in the threatening, rumbling sound. The archivist stepped in front of her protectively, a twitching hand on the hilt of his saber. Wary eyes not leaving his opponent, he whispered to her. Run as soon as I engage. I will try to buy you time. Emphasis on try. There is little more I can do against him. Bloody Jedi Theatrix. Give me your saber. Then, she hissed. No, we'd both die. Don't worry about me. As if. Just go save yourself. I am at peace. Why are you trembling with blind fear, idiot? Zayathris barely kept from rolling her eyes. Like a mantra, the Jedi repeated as he took a few tentative steps forward. There is no emotion, there is peace. The essential lie which had led countless Jedi to a premature death. The stranger ignited his saber, a Makashi opening. Zayathris gave an amused snort. Probably the oddest possible choice of lightsaber style for a Darksider. Her Jedi companion had not been excessively pessimistic about his chances. He barely managed to parry if his crude attempts could be called that 2 strikes of his unimpressed opponent, before he was swiftly disarmed and flung across the room with a satisfying crack. As his body hit the far wall, his lightsaber rolled uselessly between them. The elderly man looked her up and down impassively. A pity he delayed his departure to retrieve his tramp. He was so close to safety, after all. Detachedly, he raised his saber to strike her down. When his red blade met with a green one instead of bones and soft flesh, his eyes briefly widened with bewilderment. Getting ahead of yourself, old man, Zayathris snarled viciously as she moved into position for a counterattack. It seems I underestimated you, Jidi. I shall not be making that mistake again. He replied in that booming, patronizing voice of his. Oh, you wish a Jidi would grant you mercy. She gave a ferocious scream as she lunged at him. A few minutes into the fight, it was Zayathris who had to admit to a miscalculation. She should have long overpowered him by now, but his energy-conserving style was giving him a clear advantage. Coupled with her weakened state, that was a surefire recipe for a pointless, embarrassing death. At the same time, she was still holding back the full extent of her powers to not reveal herself as Sith. As long as she did not know what manner of Chirax's nest she had stirred up, she had better not make additional enemies, especially with the Jedi being her best shot at getting off this planet. Exhausted already, my dear, let me end your plight. The man almost purred in a honeyed voice, disengaging from the battle with a gracious leap. The reprieve was short-lived as a powerful stream of lightning poured from his outstretched hand. To Zayathris' own surprise, she failed to raise the borrowed saber in time. White-hot agony racked through her body, causing her to double over. It took all her strength to keep from convulsing uncontrollably, but slowly, as the man approached to finish her off, she managed to withstand the pain and lifted her head in defiance. 2 pairs of blazing amber eyes met. The cavern collapsed behind you, and then you decided to overcome the minor setback of the surface elevator platform, having been shot to pieces by strapping the unconscious Jedi to your back with his utility belt. The soldier's voice was filled with what was either utter disbelief or awe, and then proceeded to climb down 200 meters with this dead weight attached. Zayathris could not help wondering who in their right mind would issue an almost completely white armor to their troops for any place that wasn't Hoth or Ilum. As far as environmental camouflage was concerned, that was an absolute nightmare. They had not even used temporary paint to blend in better with the surroundings back on the planet. At least it had made it easier for her to spot the Republic encampment. Still, it boggled the mind. She remembered the heated discussions with her captain about the universal appropriateness of her fully black armor, who had only relented when she had proposed completing the next assignment, wearing nothing but her army green training bra and shorts instead. Compared to the choice of attire of some of her fellow Sith, it would not have been particularly outrageous, though somewhat understated. Pierce had enthusiastically upvoted the idea, and even Vet seconded it, if only for laughs. She would even have done it, maybe not on Hoth or even a place like Terrace, just to see Quinn's face. On second thought, it would have been a little too distracting, keeping him from performing at peak efficiency. I already explained this to your leader, the one with the colorful helmet. Twice, actually. I will let you know that I dislike having to repeat myself. The trooper gave a cough to cover his uncertainty. Ma'am, no offense intended, but we don't usually have unknown civilians turning up like this. You mean naked and bleeding profusely, because a belt is not a suitable harness for transporting people. She shot back acidly. These troopers were too dang suspicious for her liking, even though the circumstances were probably fairly unique. They had mentioned another GD being on the ship, apparently a battlecruiser, though from her estimations, significantly larger than a Harrower-class dreadnought. Wildly excessive for a local conflict over resources, so using a force suggestion was out of the question. Do you regularly encounter infiltration attempts that rely on brilliant plans like giving a random non-combatant GD a cracked skull, and then going out of their way to deliver them to your doorstep, just to get into your good graces? The three soldiers, what were the odds of identical triplets serving in the same unit, gave her a perplexed stare. Didn't think so. At least they had dressed her wounds and not put her into confinement as they originally intended to. This was turning out to be a very long day indeed. It was very telling that she had to put her trust as far as she was capable of such a sentiment into a battered, absolutely crap Y with a lightsaber, GD and his allies, instead of another Sith. At least the GD, in general, were not prone to arbitrarily stabbing you in the back, provided they remained unaware that you are their sworn enemy, especially if they lay half dead on a medical bed. It was a true blessing that her partial pureblood heritage was not immediately obvious from her appearance, at least not to non-Imperials, or that Archivist would have left her to rot or put her out of her misery instead. Besides, whatever plans that elderly Sith they had encountered in the mining complex was pursuing, it was better to leave him alone for the time being, since technically the Alliance was associated with the Empire. It was possible, considering the oddness of that separatist thing, that he was a rogue element, but best not to unwittingly pee off anyone important. Lana was close enough to suffering a stroke without Zaethris adding to her burden, though once she'd come up with a way out of this convoluted mess, she would tell Asina a few choice words for not keeping a tighter leash on their people, if they were dumb enough not to recognize the Alliance commander on sight. If the Empress was still alive after Iyakath, if not, either she had the Empire turned against her anyway, or made some powerful people madly happy, or both, actually. Sometimes she wondered how the Empire got anything done at all, giving its overall propensity to betray its own at every opportunity. As Wrath, she might have had the chance to influence the Empire's course, if only by killing off those counselors who'd gone off the deep end, relatively speaking. But the whole Vitiate business had prevented that. Ironically, since it had been Vitiate who had instated her as his Wrath. Technicalities. Number. GD Master Obi-Wan Kenobi watched the surprise guest through the medical ward's window, before entering to get an impression of her. Clad in trooper undergarments and hunched over in exhaustion, she nevertheless was an imposing figure, approaching even his former Padawan in height and, despite the obvious state of emaciation, rather muscular. Her physicality was undeniably intense. Messy neck-length black hair framed her sharp-featured, angular face. His contemplative gaze lingered on the weary, light gray eyes that formed a stark contrast to the slightly reddish, dark skin. There was something out of place about them, but he could not pin down what. He tentatively extended his senses towards her to get a more comprehensive assessment, but her low-key presence just slipped away. There was no doubt it was there, otherwise unremarkable and well within reach, but it was oddly transparent, for lack of a better word, like he could only see her clearly when he was not looking right at her. Mental techniques apart from mind tricks had never been exactly his forte, yet the Force apparently refusing to cooperate was just one more indication how much the war was getting to him. Well, there was always talking. Upon entering the ward, for a brief instant, he felt utterly exposed to the woman's measuring look. as if he was prey being sized up. However, when they made eye contact, the feeling vanished just as abruptly, and a perfectly pleasant smile spread across her face, with no signs of duplicity. "You must be the GD general I was told to wait for, Master Obi-Wan Kenobi." He introduced himself. "Knight Bacon owes his survival to your selfless aid, and I would like to extend thanks in his stead." Zathras tensed and straightened. She must not have heard him correctly. She slowly inclined her head in bemused acknowledgement, but remained silent, too stunned by his decidedly imperial accent to form a coherent reply. When she had first seen the tattoo on the side of one of the troopers' head, she had not thought much of it. Perhaps it represented a decisive victory against the empire to which he had contributed. But then the symbol that bore a stunning similarity to the imperial insignia of all things instead of the familiar Republic symbol, or the two-winged GD, one appeared in other places on the ship, and some of the soldiers' armor plates too. Was this some kind of splinter faction of the Empire? Then again, GD in front of her gave off no indication of being dark, and the armor itself looked more Mandalorian in design, rather than anything else. "So, Commander Devis briefed me on your report already, but failed to mention how you ended up in Farnasi custody in the first place." Zathras could sense no suspicion in his words, only genuine interest. She would not consider herself a particularly subtle woman by any definition, but she had spent considerable time around exceptional agents like Sifr 9 or Theron Chan. "I wish I could remember. One moment I am going about my business and the next I woke up in a mine, with what feels like the worst hangover of my life." Kenobi nodded sympathetically. Theron would surely be proud, though his trademark innocent and long-suffering act was going to be quite a stretch for her. "So, what does that daily business of yours entail? Is surviving an adequate answer?" She shrugged nonchalantly, with everything around her contradicting the supposed status quo of the situation between the Empire and the Republic. There was no way she could come up with a cover story that didn't risk raising alarm, so vague would have to suffice. "If this is all you're willing to tell me about yourself, I have no choice but to accept it. However, you need not fear judgment from my side." She pushed off the medical bed to stand in front of the GD expectantly. "What's going to happen to me now? You've been very supportive, and the Republic has no reason to keep you from your business. Therefore, I propose to drop you off somewhere of your choosing on the way to Coruscant. In Republic space, preferably, given the current state of war. But there are neutral worlds along the hyperspace route as well." She gave her assent wordlessly. So these people were pubs after all. "If you would follow me to my ship, the cruiser is going to jump to hyperspace soon. Number. How did the negotiations go?" Kenobi turned around in the captain's chair and gave her a quizzical look. "On Farnas 2. Bacon told me there was a negotiator inbound. I assume that was you. You would be correct? It went about as well as you'd expect. Hence the, speedy retreat. The commander told me you arrived just minutes before the agreement with the locals ran out. I suppose it was for the better that I wasn't aware. I briefly contemplated leaving Bacon behind. Wasn't sure if that creepy idiot would come after us." "Creepy, I beg your pardon." Kenobi's brows furrowed, emphasizing the faint lines on his forehead. "A Force user blocked our exit. Bacon protected me." She had to muster all her self-control to keep from smirking at the fairly inflated description of the GD's performance. The GD's shock at that revelation was evident. "And you haven't mentioned this before, because no one asked." She smiled noncommittally. "They were more concerned with my identity and how we'd escaped the mines. That, and getting the transport off the ground under heavy fire." "Can you describe the Force user, as you call them?" "Older human with an aristocratic air about him and a deep voice. Modest attire. Unarmored and carrying a single red saber." "Dooku." The GD muttered darkly. "You survived an encounter with a Sith Lord. Just how?" "Well, Bacon almost didn't. He got slammed into the wall without that guy even needing to touch him." She embellished her explanation with what she hoped was an adequate amount of naivety about the Force. "As for how the complex collapsed before he got to us to finish the deed, he didn't follow us. No idea why. Perhaps he was crushed or thought we were dead." She rose from the co-pilot seat and took in the design of the ship's cockpit. Definitely another model she hadn't seen before. "So, that was an actual Sith. From your description, the man you chanced upon is Count Dooku, the leader of the Separatists. He also goes by Darth Tyrannus." Zathras struggled to place the name. Surely not a counselor. But even a mere Darth should not be this unfamiliar. Her lack of recognition was disconcerting. And why a random upstart should meddle in the affairs of non-imperial space like this posed a mystery too. If she had lost another couple of years, why was he on Farnas 2 to interrupt the negotiations? No, that would have ended in bloodshed. He gave a small, almost self-deprecating smile. I wasn't even aware he was planetside. He doesn't usually show up in person. I can't believe I missed the opportunity to face him. This war has been going on for too long. This was a galaxy-spanning conflict instead of a local skirmish. Just how influential were these separatists? Moreover, from which faction had they separated in the first place? Given the Sith's involvement, the Empire seemed the most likely candidate. Was Tyrannus following in Malgus's footsteps? Then, what in Malachor was going on? She needed time to process the new information and nurse her pounding headache. How long until we drop out of hyperspace? Number. Zayathris had spent the previous few hours attempting to meditate inconspicuously. That had turned out rather awkward and, to make matters even worse, calling upon the Force, no matter how superficially, was utterly disorienting. Like navigating unfamiliar space with an inaccurate map. The background hum of the Force felt both darker overall, yet not dark enough at the same time. There were the obvious things: major loss of life, creating countless reverberations in the Force, likely the result of the ongoing war, conflict, betrayal. Yet, beneath the comforting throb of the dark existed a strange undercurrent that felt deeply unnatural. Like a heavy layer of immobile dust covering everything, instead of permeating the universe. The strength of the dark side was undiminished, but it seemed indisputably less pervasive, less alive, for lack of a better word, than it used to. Perhaps that was just her. Though, the carbonite poisoning after her involuntary 5-year stint on Zakuul had somewhat similar aftereffects. Even more disturbing, there also was something in the back of her mind that kept itching. Perhaps a repressed memory. Hopefully not an uninvited guest like Vitiate. But without actually using the Force properly. She was simply chasing ghosts. Or she'd gone insane after all, which would be the most harmless explanation for just about everything and not even unlikely, given the unspeakable things she had been through. She briefly contemplated killing Kenobi, just so she could meditate in peace. She laughed near hysterically at the wording of her own thoughts, or rather, without a bloody GD master looming over her back. On a second thought, she was not sure she could fly the ship on her own. Probably should not have delegated menial tasks like that to her crew all the time. The GD poked his head into the cargo hold where she had temporarily taken up residence. I apologize, but there has been a change of plans. We are making a detour to Mandalore. You will stay on the ship, out of harm's way. I really shouldn't drag you into this, but there's no time to let you disembark before we get there. His face was ashen. Out of harm's way. Ominous. What happened? I received a distress call from their leader. The details got drowned out by her perturbed stream of thoughts. The Mandalorians asking the Republic, specifically the GD, for help. This was getting more ludicrous by the minute. Asking for the current year was a bit too obvious, however. She was shaking with exertion as she tried to keep from smashing everything in sight. Her gracious GD host would not take kindly to that. Criffet, patience, number. As it turned out, the GD's plan, if there ever was one, somehow this did not seem like a well-planned operation to her, got scrapped right at the start. Staying on the ship was not an option after Kenobi had to knock out 2 Mandalorian patrols on inspection duty. Afterwards, disguised in Mandalorian armor, a move which would not have endeared them to the Mandos she knew. Outsiders wearing Beskar was an insult. A sacrilege. Even they had made their way to the prison complex with no further hang-ups, suspiciously enough. However, when their ship was shot down during the ensuing rescue attempt, things had gone into full-on Fuber territory. A pair of Sith. This time their commitment to the dark side was evident at first glance. Had appeared on the scene. Whatever explanation there was for their presence on Mandalore. However, nothing conformed to expectations lately. Kenobi had been elusive about what the Criffing void was going on, though who could blame the man? When he was obviously worried sick about the prospect of failure, his emotional turmoil almost tangible. The 2 Zabraks who had obviously been expecting Kenobi and him only had taken the GD and the women he'd been supposed to free, a Duchess Satine, prisoners. Zayathris refused to devote any brain capacity to pondering how come the Mandalorians were apparently ruled by a Duchess. Having managed to evade attention, the Zayathris sat perched on a little alcove above the throne room and watched the situation unfold with growing confusion. All parties involved had history, that much was clear. The GD's anguish betrayed his deep attachment to the woman. The Cyborg Sith, on the other hand, felt volatile, like a broken vessel haphazardly glued back together. Moreover, he had the borderline psychotic sadist act down to a trill. He fully embodied the kind of unhinged Sith that, in the former Wrath's view, had no future in the Empire. Your fatal flaw is shared by you and your Duchess. On cue, the red Zabrak called, Darth. Maul lifted the captive woman off the ground, gradually constricting her airflow as they spoke. You should have chosen the dark side, Master GD. Your emotions betray you. Your fear. And yes, he hissed, pausing for effect. Your anger. Let your anger deepen your hatred. You can kill me, but you will never destroy me. As if death was the worst thing the one might want to inflict a Jedi. He obviously lacked creativity. And instead of crushing his enemy where he stood, the potential was certainly there. Thus saving the woman he apparently loved, Kenobi opted to spew more naive drivel instead. The Jedi brainwashing went incredibly deep on this one. Still, in tandem with the situation escalating, the darkness had pooled around Kenobi, fed by his deeply held rage surfacing. It was pulsing off him in ever-increasing waves, like a tempest drawing ashore. It was beautiful to behold. Kenobi, with all his self-discipline and determination, would make a superb Sith. Unfortunately, that would seriously complicate matters even more at present. If he was this close, it would not be hard to give him a little shove later on, in the right setting, where this magnificent power would be hers to direct. An uncontrolled fall then, and there was probably something no one present would survive, including herself. She did not trust herself to find the right words to guide Kenobi properly. He was essentially a stranger. Moreover, she was not exactly a natural at that master and apprentice thing. Unbelievably, despite barely holding on, Kenobi still tried to criffing talk the Zabrak out of torturing the Duchess, as if one could negotiate. If this were any of her people threatened like that, she would have ripped the cyborg to shreds of flesh and synth skin without hesitation. Once more, the pathetic weakness of the Jedi was getting people killed over so-called ideals that were supposed to protect them in the first place. More lies. It takes strength to resist the dark side, of course, but could he not see how much more power he could gain through that very strength if he stopped limiting himself? The screeching in the Force built to a crescendo as Kenobi twitched in grasp of the Mandalorian guard, eyes wide with fear and horror, and oh so many delicious emotions, before his presence all but shriveled upon itself. He was giving up. She would not allow him to sacrifice his attachment, not when it was such a useful tool. With such a storm of passion raging inside just seconds before, he could not possibly keep clinging to the light. She had to act. Just wait now. The moment the darksaber in Maul's hand ignited, she pushed herself off the ledge, both augmenting the jump and bracing her impact on the floor with the Force. The Jedi was likely too distracted to notice something as minute as that. Using the momentum, she yanked the towering cyborg's arm down hard, creating a lever with her thankfully armored shoulder, and smirked inwardly at the wet crunch of a bone breaking. The limp form of the Duchess flew past them and rolled down the stairs, coming to a halt at Kenobi's knees. The dark saber dropped into Zathris's hand as she ducked behind the Zabrak to strike at the other Sith, who lunged towards her. Maul snapped out of his confused daze and attempted to slam his leg into her knee. She leapt backward, bringing the saber to a low rear guard. A few meters to her left, Kenobi had somehow dispatched the guards and freed himself. Hi there. Her mouth twisted into a triumphantly cruel leer. Both Sith charged at her, rage blazing in their eyes. She purposely sidestepped them, batting one side of the dual blade out of the way to skid past beneath it. Immediately spinning around, she brought her saber up, slashing across the larger opponent's lower back. That fueled the other's fury, who sent her flying across the room with a force push she didn't dare block completely. Kenobi joined the fight while she picked herself up. Get the Duchess to safety. The Jedi roared as he blocked another strike. Zathris decided to give Kenobi the opportunity to take his revenge. Perhaps that would corrupt him further. She dashed across the room and scooped up the lithe woman. Now, she simply had to figure out where to find a safe spot in this completely unknown place. They hadn't come far before encountering a group of Mandalorians who were, uncharacteristically, not shooting at them and instead helped them evade the barrage of blaster shots from those who were. The barely conscious Duchess opted to trust them, even though they also appeared to be associated with Death Watch, a faction which so far had seemed to be on Maul's side. Zathris had long given up trying to make sense of the allegiances of the people in whose troubles she kept getting caught up in. After exchanging the darksaber, allegedly a traditional Mandalorian weapon, for a reinforced staff, she joined the small group in search for shelter. Leave. Leave. A visceral warning jolted through her. Something was coming, and whatever, or rather whoever that was, she was in no state to fight them. The dark was gradually building up, becoming so oppressive, so dense, it was almost difficult to breathe without reaching into the Force to dissipate the pressure. If she just let go, she would float in a sensation that felt like viscous liquid seeping into every pore, and probably get pulled into a maelstrom. She had no desire to test her hypothesis. On closer examination, she realized that the presence was not inherently threatening. This was no second-zeist. It just felt so consuming, in a deeply unnatural way, as if the Force was pouring all things dark into a single vessel. The last time she'd sensed something as perplexing had been vitiate. That was not possible. It was not. She already hated the owner of that presence for causing her to doubt, however briefly, her achievements, her strength. Pure, unadulterated darkness. A weaker being would feel the urge to prostrate themselves and worship it. The potential for unlimited power. She was surprised by the intensity of her own craving for it. That was new. She had to leave immediately. They had lost a once proud, fierce empire and its billions of people reduced to a mere footnote in history. The magnificent empire she and myriads of others had loyally fought for, bled for, had perished. Their nemesis, the Republic, had proven victorious. A corrupt and decaying system built on stagnancy and the pseudo-democratic rule of the weak triumphing over discipline and the primacy of power. It boggled the mind. Going by the superficial historic overviews she'd been able to access on the Holonet, it had been a slow expiry, not a glorious last stand off throwing everything they had left at their archfoe. Instead, the empire had slowly withered away until it had apparently become too inconsequential to even be recorded properly in the historical documents. What a cruelly ironic, undignified development. The Sith purebloods, as a species, appeared to be unknown nowadays, at best amounting to fictional monsters. Fitting, since much of what she had read ultimately belonged into the realm of legends. There was absolutely no useful information on the first centuries after the sacking of Coruscant. Mostly scientific extrapolations that, with her first-hand knowledge of 34 years give or take a few years spent trapped in carbonite, actually living during that time, seemed rather improbable. Following that, there were mentions of various iterations the Sith Order had gone through, until it simply vanished with the death of one Darth Bane. The Republic, on the other hand, had also been reformed on several occasions in the meantime, in tandem with the Jedi Order's influence waxing, and then lately, waning. Suspiciously, there was no recent information on the Sith, which she could attest to undeniably existed, available to the public. Classified likely meant relevant to the war. Zayathras was still not convinced the official interpretation of how the separatists tied into things was completely correct. The war provided an excellent opportunity to destabilize an ailing republic. Judging from the economic and political news, it was a veritable cesspool of corruption rotting from within, which had to be obvious to anyone capable of reading between the lines. Yet, for the Sith to expose themselves after more than a millennium hiding in the shadows, there had to be more at play. In fact, nothing less than a pivotal opening or cataclysmic event looming ahead. Given that the Sith, though how much their views had in common with the teachings of her time was unclear, were still around, there was certainly a chance they had simply retreated into the unknown regions, similar to how Vitiate's empire had sought refuge in its early days. Perhaps Bane had been a decoy, much like Darth Revan, a necessary sacrifice to put the minds of the Jedi at ease. Regardless of what had transpired, she had no place in that conjectural Imperial remnant. Whatever they had built up once more in secret, as an outsider, she was simply a rogue element to them, a threat, unless she ruthlessly clawed her way up to the very top to, mostly figuratively speaking, stand on a pile of bloody corpses. A bleak, not to mention wasteful prospect. She would never amount to anything again. Besides, these hypothetical Imperials were not her people. She owed them nothing. Her interference would get her nowhere. The most plausible assumption, however, was that the Empire had continued on its earlier trajectory of ceaseless power grabs and betrayals, at inopportune times, laying ruin to even the most reasonable campaigns. If backstabbing had been at the root of the Empire's demise, by its own philosophies, it had deserved to fall. The Sith, and by extension, the Empire, would have proven itself unworthy of victory. The lure of false power exposing a fatal flaw. In that case, she had even less incentive to do anything born out of blind allegiance to a failed ideology. The slow tapering out also explained the accent and symbolism. Perhaps at some point, the two societies had merged instead of one subjugating the other, and certain aspects assimilated into the modern republic. Given how knowledge tended to become twisted by the passage of time or lost altogether, it was not unlikely. It felt painfully unreal to be the only legacy of the old empire. Her borrowed datapad gleamed in the dimly lit room. A figure shifted next to her and gave off a muffled sound. Still reading, beautiful. When she did not reply, the man propped himself up on his elbows and looked at her with drowsy eyes. You know, I might be up for another round. Can't imagine that research of yours is more enticing than me. She waved the offer off, eyes glued to the text, even though the words had long stopped registering in her brain. Ever since she had found out the truth, she had been in a constant daze, drained of any ambition or purpose. It was not the allegedly serene peace of the Jedi, just a numbing absence of useful emotions. Without a clear foe, she had nowhere to direct her absolute fury, so it just burned her from within. giving her little respite to do anything productive to improve her situation. The pain, at least, felt good. Before close to 4 millennia had passed her by, she had always had an outlet for her raging emotions in the form of a steady stream of enemies to kill or, at times, in more enjoyably passionate ways. The latter now rang empty. Her gaze flickered to the Zoltron half asleep by her side, his light pink skin contrasting with the luxurious dark sheets. Sleep wouldn't come, so she put her black tunic, tightly fitting trousers and boots back on, and headed upstairs for the rooftop bar of the hotel they were staying at. While it was difficult to get sufficiently drunk with her metabolism and learn force techniques for purging the effects of various poisons, including ethanol, perhaps the effort would help her forget, at least for a few hours. She had left the Mandalorian capital in a hurry, a calculated retreat, not running away. She tried to tell herself, forcing her way onto a ship manned by positively grotesque-looking aliens, who turned out to be in league with Maul. They had reached a small refueling station before the situation went from bad to worse, resulting in the vaguely humanoid's swift deaths by asphyxiation. She had had weeks to come to terms with her new life. Weeks spent doing anything but that. She had gone from stowaway to manager of her own little slaving operation, or what officially passed for it. In truth, it was quite the opposite. After arriving on yet another planet populated by scum, she had taken the liberty to employ the services of a Valjean, a Zeltron hooker, who had been elated to be booked for 3 consecutive days. Finding out that she merely intended to question him on the state of the galaxy, whatever little he knew, and use his personal datapad, had come as a veritable surprise to him. His disappointment did not last long. His odd customer, in addition to her unusual requests, he found he could hardly make sense of her pheromones, even though she looked human enough, had grown more unhappy about her findings, to the point of shaking with anger and agitated pacing. He found it difficult to ignore the crushing terror creeping up his spine in her presence, but he had no choice but to stay. She did not hurt him and instead ultimately decided to work out her frustrations with his help extensively. Valjean couldn't help being somewhat flattered by her attentions. It was rare for him to become an instant favorite with a customer, despite his genetic advantages. He did not manage to learn much about her, but given her demeanor and athletic build, he surmised that she was ex-military or something in that vein. She was a dangerous woman with few scruples and clearly little to lose. It would have been entirely remiss of him not to try to use that to his advantage. When he proposed she help him kill his owner, she laughed him off at first, before doing a double take and seriously considering the idea, clearly intrigued by his bold proposal. They spent 2 days plotting, and when the opportunity came, he was relieved to find he had not misjudged her. Although the practiced brutality with which she unflinchingly tore through the slavers' guards was unexpected. She even encouraged him to finish his owner off himself. He took his time, exacting vengeance for years of abuse, while his new ally watched, relishing the scene with a lopsided smirk on her face. He was unsure what to make of that, but had little time to contemplate, as she revealed to him her plan of taking over the slaving operation as a cover. For what? He would find out soon enough. They cleaned up, making it look like a gang-related feud, and called in the other slaves. Those wishing to leave, the majority, unsurprisingly, were set free without further ado. Those that remained received an intriguing offer. They could either continue in their current line of work or receive basic training as assassins in order to be sold, and, at a convenient time, kill their new masters if they turned out to be unjust. Preferably not before training more of their fellow slaves. Those who had been through several owners already and experienced mistreatment at their hands needed not think twice before taking the unique opportunity. The circles she moved in nowadays, not even directly most of the time but by proxy through Valjean, disgusted her. That wretched hive of slavers and criminals, rife with debauchery and depravity of the worst kind, had it coming. Zaethris did not believe in handing out charity, but empowering the powerless was an interesting experiment of how far the reach of the dark side went for non-force sensitives. The slaves, above all, had the most tangible chains to break. If they managed to fulfill their purpose, thus getting their revenge and ideally freeing themselves in the process, they proved their worthiness. Zaethris had never been an ardent supporter of slavery, until getting to know Vet more. She had not even considered it a particularly contentious issue. It was simply the way the Empire operated. She had not cared much for the superiority complex of many of her fellow Imperials. Instead, she held the, in her time, minority view that with strength came responsibility for the lives of those weaker than oneself. Just as some were destined to rule, and how far that rule extended depended on the individual's power, others were only fit to serve. Anyone who was content with their lot as servant, should not be forced to make their own decisions. Nevertheless, there was no point in mistreating them, thereby breeding fear and disobedience, which in turn led to resistance. Besides, while torturing slaves was as good as any other method for fueling the dark side, one did not have to turn into a bully to harness its power. In addition to frowning upon gratuitous violence towards inferior beings, she believed that in order to truly create a society where individual strength was a basic tenet, everyone should be afforded a chance to empower themselves, including slaves. As she picked up her drink, she idly wondered if Nox would approve of her little endeavor. "Ah, that's no doubt the sweetest thing you've ever done for me." The glass shattered in her hand. 1,000 pieces stained the color of blood flew apart in slow motion. Zaithra sat frozen in place trying to make sense of what had just happened, while she watched the amber contents gradually dripping from the bar counter. Her subconscious might have valiantly tried to protect her from fully realizing the implications, but ever since her awakening in this new, disagreeable world, it had been there, like a second, oddly discordant, heartbeat, only to manifest into a fuzzy but familiar presence, a disembodied voice inside her mind, all of a sudden while she was trying to unwind. What encryffing malachor is this? Zaithra snarled mentally. Vitiate's unbidden sojourn had left deeper scars than she cared to admit. Amusement flared up. "You not recognizing me grieves my heart. It's me, your dear friend Nox. I know who you are, but how come this?" She trailed off, thoroughly confused. "It's just not possible. Besides, you actually have, or rather, had, I guess, a heart, certainly. What do you take me for, a monster? Anyway, it's a riveting story. I assure you, cut the theatrics. Do you want to repeat your revelation for a grander entrance? I'm in a generous mood. I might even give you a welcome cheer. Or do you require a formal request, mighty Counselor Darth Nox? I implore you to elucidate. Or something like that." "Nah, I'm good. I've had sufficient time to, get settled in. By the way, as for welcome presents, the last couple of weeks were thoroughly satisfying for my voyeuristic tendencies. You have excellent taste in men, my Lord Wrath, visually at least. Personality-wise, however, it's kind of hit or miss as per usual." Zaithris gave an exasperated growl. "Case in point, hooking up with you during our academy days, Russian, a small, fleeting sensation best described as a wince, appeared at the mention of Darth Nox's slave name. Clearly, these were not her own emotions. "Well, I for one have fond memories of that time," he solicited sheepishly. "Indeed, you might be the only one with that view. But we digress. What are you doing in my mind? Make yourself comfortable. Maybe get another drink first, a nice strong absinthe. If I get any say, it's going to be a long and fascinating tale," he replied with exaggerated cheerfulness, causing Zaithris to roll her eyes. "Well, I guess I should start with Iyakath. After you'd gone rushing off to use the controls on the remaining throne, most Alliance personnel tried to prepare for evac. However, it seemed like the weapon was activating despite your efforts. With massive energy fluctuations in the building and a violent tempest raging outside, the lightning was deep purple. You should have seen it. It was so gorgeous." Nox suddenly gave off a sheepish vibe. Ahem, back to the topic. Beniko was having a major meltdown, yelling at people to do useless stuff when the storm abruptly ended. "We already thought we'd made it. But then a massive shockwave hit the control center. Next thing I remember is being patched up by Imperial medics. Turned out they'd been further from the blast, while the pubs got the worst of it. Good thing you decided to ally with Empress Asina. Might have been the end of the Alliance right there otherwise. That would have been a pretty lame demise, if you ask me. But admittedly, the reality isn't particularly glorious either. Anyway, once I was no longer in danger of stomach acid dissolving my vital organs, turns out even I can't keep healing myself indefinitely when impaled on a durasteel beam. Funny that I lead a small team to recover your body." Hey, there really wasn't much hope at that point. The building of the throne room had been reduced to a gigantic, still smoking pile of sparkling ash. It was quite the sight. Imagine my surprise to find the throne encased in some kind of transparent crystal-like substance, with you on it, obviously, physically completely intact. She grimaced as she absent-mindedly pulled the last shard of the smashed glass from her hand, completely engrossed in Nox's account of what had occurred on Iyakath. Fast forward 5 decades and 3 emperors, still no progress getting you out. At least your state hadn't changed at all, as far as we could tell. Alas, I wasn't getting any younger. No help from our dear Imperials either. Frankly, at some point people mostly stopped caring about the former Wrath and Alliance commander, when they had more pressing matters like the economy collapsing to deal with. So I came up with a plan. Don't you dare laugh, which, on flimsy, sounded absolutely marvelous. She couldn't help chuckling quietly at that. And pray tell, what did your brilliant plan entail? Nox's plans were usually the antithesis of sane and helpful. Ironically, in the end, He always emerged victorious and more powerful than ever, but had likely stumbled through every possible and impossible trap and gleefully poked every Shirak's nest on his way there. The man was an absolute walking disaster and still managed to be a smarmy little idiot about his achievements. That he was, despite the inevitable price of his mastery of the dark side, clearly visible around his eyes. Unreasonably handsome if you were into intricate facial tattoos and pale green skin, probably not a major turn-on for most Imperials. Then again, power certainly didn't help either. For some unfathomable reason, the Force seemed to have taken a liking to him, allowing him to get away with the craziest stuff. Or actually far more plausible, it took sadistic enjoyment in putting Nox through edifying experiences like slavery, body-snatching attempts, near death, and sharing his head with a bunch of ghosts, who were probably at least as insane as their more or less willing host. Remember what my lovely old master tried to do to me? I studied Zasha's rituals and, coupled with my own research and experiments, figured the only way of getting you out was to ditch your body and just transfer your essence into another vessel. So this sounds a little creepy when phrased like this. You what? Zayathras gasped indignantly. It was a viable idea. I won't dismiss an idea just because it sounds a little crazy. Obviously, that's not what came to pass, or I wouldn't be here. I had picked the perfect body, very similar to yours. The woman was even quite enthusiastic about the whole thing, or at least, I didn't hear her complain. Come to think about it, I should have explained the goal a bit more explicitly. At any rate, she was probably fine, provided nothing exploded when the ritual went wrong and she got out of the caves afterwards. Or Kem didn't eat her out of irritation or something. An odd sensation flitted across her mind as Nox apparently made a placating gesture or whatever passed for it without a body. The former wrath massaged a growing headache. She idly wondered how the other members of the council managed to sit through sessions with Nox without breaking things. She really wanted to break something right now. Accidentally smashing a glass was hardly cathartic enough. So, what actually happened? That's just the thing. I don't know. I spent 3 millennia trying to figure it out. At that level, sorcery just is very unpredictable. You can't just cast these things on a whim. You have to sustain all the energy flows that are part of the ritual at once. But I had cross-referenced all the texts, quadruple-checked the incantations. For all his unusual abilities and accumulated knowledge, Nox was ridiculously easy, not to mention entertaining, to rile up. In their current predicament, they were at each other's mercy. So you failed because you were weak. And mercy was a sentiment rarely found among the Sith. Are you quite finished hurting my feelings? My working hypothesis is that the throne stasis gizmo creates a kind of event horizon within that doesn't allow anything out, in order to maintain the equilibrium inside, or just because the Ayakathi engineers were evil. I mean, you've been there, it's a death trap disguised as a planet. Who cares at this point? It basically worked the other way round, with you ending up in my body instead. A gross oversimplification, never mind. Essentially, yeah, that's about it. I am glad I ordered Kem to guard your crypt, for lack of a better word, in case the ritual went wrong. Probably ensured that we were left alone for a long time. I wonder what became of him, but that's not important right now. Thanks for being so accommodating. By the way, that could have gone very badly for my spirit. And you, to be honest. That's Zayathras exhaled resignedly, putting it mildly. A grin. We have always been survivors, haven't we? Oh, congrats by the way. We achieved near immortality, however temporary, without resorting to planet-wide massacres. Temporary immortality, isn't that an oxymoron? So what? We even surpassed vitiate. Nox's slight tendency to become overly excited about irrelevant aspects had not mellowed with the passage of time. Splendid. The downside being that stasis is rather dull. So I would not say it was particularly worthwhile. At least you had your dreams and stuff, so you don't get to complain. I just languished in the back of your mind, unable to do anything. Luckily, you were already crazy to begin with. Or you'd definitely be now. That's a brutal assessment, but probably accurate. Yeah, the only entertainment I had was looking at your memories. Got boring after a few decades. You did not sift through my memories. Don't worry, your secrets are safe with me. Literally, it's not like I am going anywhere for the foreseeable future. Though I must say I didn't expect your captain to have a decidedly kinky side to him. Shut up, she snapped aloud, causing more than a few heads to turn into her direction. Before thinking better of it, I just complimented your husband. Don't mention him, she hissed, or I'm going to eradicate you, like you consumed your ghosts. Huh. Entirely inappropriate mirth was washing over her. Ahem. I shall make an educated guess. You have no idea how to do that without seriously endangering your own life. Whether I live or die is inconsequential, don't you realize? The Empire is gone. The Sith reduced to what exactly? I have no idea. No one I ever cared about is left. Nox made a whining sound. Yes, apart from you. But this arrangement is far from ideal. You don't give a flying criff about others, so it's not the same for you. Zaithris downed her last shot of alcohol. You're wrong, Nox replied sullenly, breaking the uneasy silence after a while. I do miss Theron. Oh come on. You're telling me he was more than a passing amusement to you? Of course. This time. Dang it. You are correct. They are all dead. It doesn't matter anymore. The upside is, we have been liberated from these attachments that chained us to mediocrity. The pain of loss is a wellspring of power. Nothing left but to harness that. Zaithris worked her jaw. While she disliked the conclusion he had drawn, she had to admit that Nox's view was the only one that would allow her to move forward. You're insufferable, Nox. Yep. She half imagined him giving a slow, lascivious smirk. You wouldn't have me any other way. I would literally have you any other way than in my head. Now you're giving me ideas. Zaithris was not ignorant of the fact that her business venture's approach would inevitably implode as soon as a significant number of slaves began to carry out their designated task. There were of course ways of obfuscating ownership and rerouting the flow of goods to obscure her involvement. Regardless, there was no denying the planned obsolescence aspect of the whole endeavor looming in the background. Not to mention the immediate repercussions if a slave failed in too obvious a manner. Valjean really came into his own managing the stakeholders and taking care of the finer details. She could hardly picture him as a callous crime lord, but he excelled at manipulation. She had to give him that. She was glad not to be entangled too deeply in the operational aspect of it. In fact, she detested all the scheming involved. Building a power base was one thing, though even then she favored true, direct displays of strength in battle over intrigue and secretly plotting against her enemies. She was certainly not the mindless brute the blunt tool Darth Baras had taken her for, but she preferred to leave the maneuvering to those who actually enjoyed that kind of thing. People were unreasonably complicated if she had to deal with them rather than merely fighting alongside them, bound by duty and a common objective or developing a certain sense of kinship like she had with Vet. She usually preferred them pinned underneath her, either in utter defeat or ecstasy, depending on the alignment and attractiveness of the person in question. Her focus on tangible power had probably been one of the reasons why she had not seen the transponder station incident coming, which kept looming in the back of her head as one of her greatest failures, even after all those years. Quinn certainly had never forgotten it either, since it had earned him a top-grade cybernetic arm as a constant reminder of his mistake. Zaithris did not believe in forgiveness, but if she could keep her one-time enemies this close, was it not an impressive testament to her power? Even during her time as Alliance commander, she had always kept one of Quinn's last letters, the one discussing their possible legacy, letting the bitterness that made her chest clench when perusing the all-too-familiar lines fuel her rage whenever she required it. If she did not allow her attachments to become a weakness, they could not pose a threat to her. She refused to take the path of least resistance, the quick and easy approach that Malgus had utilized killing Alina Daru. At least that tragic tale had turned into a popular opera soon after Malgus's eventual demise, though the officially intended meaning was mainly a warning against fraternizing with aliens and letting one's guard down. Many of her peers had taken to viewing emotions relating to others as shackles, which to her had always seemed like a hypocritical understanding of passion. Taken to its logical conclusion, the imperative of individual freedom in itself turned into a constraint limiting your options and forcing you to discard all ties to the world. That way, the Sith could hardly claim to be superior to the Jedi practicing detachment. Now, dependence on others was another matter altogether. Letting concern for others influence your decisions was a major pitfall, but that could not mean always treating them with cruelty, or at best, indifference just to avoid becoming attached. Relationships were only a liability to the weak. Conversely, actual freedom came from the strength to protect what you laid claim to. Otherwise, the inevitable fear of loss would drive you mad or into the smothering embrace of the light, with its false promises of peace. A deathly peace that was arguably the worst chain imaginable. She had trained the first generations of slave assassins, however fanciful that term was, given the mixed results, and done her best to instill ambition and a modicum of bloodthirst in them. She had planted the seed. What came after was of little concern to her. Admittedly, she could not wait to get away from the underworld. Her meager business had not yielded her the luxury of her own ship, so she was forced to strike a deal with a group of smugglers. She would accompany them on 3 missions as additional muscle, and they would loan her a basic, hyperspace-capable ship for a limited time. She saw no reason to trust them over any of the other just as shady options, but Val Jean had vetted them thoroughly beforehand. The first 2 runs had been a breeze, and Zaithris was pleased to note that her former strength was returning gradually, to the point that having to hold back was becoming a nuisance. It was the trip to Belsavis that turned out be ill-fated, with some time to spare until they were due to rendezvous with the intermediary expecting then. Nox had pestered her until she persuaded the smugglers to make a major detour, in search of a kind of sentient artificial intelligence called Asha, though she had not divulged that. Apparently, despite a refusal to prolong Nox's life after he had freed her, there is solace in finality. A mother must think of all of her children to protect them, even from themselves. The AI had made other promises to him that he intended to capitalize on. What he had failed to take into account was how thoroughly glaciers could shape a planet's surface over the course of a few thousand years. The smugglers' patience wearing thin, they ultimately had to abandon the impromptu exploration. They touched down in an area not covered with ice that appeared to be the outskirts of a Republic colonization effort, and waited for their contact. When he failed to show, the smugglers sent Zaithris to scout ahead. She had little say in the matter, though she colorfully threatened them should they attempt to leave her behind. As it turned out, whatever goods the gang had intended to smuggle, the Republic was seriously peeved about the intrusion. There had been no indication of trespassing being prohibited, the settlement was not even fortified, but when she was swiftly taken into custody upon entering the site, she vowed to be even more careful next time. The military presence had certainly come as a surprise. The troopers seemed to packing up, however, so Zaithris had a nagging suspicion that she served as a distraction for the smugglers' real plan, which undoubtedly was far more troublesome, not to mention illegal, than they had let on. Killing enough of the soldiers to facilitate her getaway would not pose a problem, so she delayed her escape to give her backstabbing associates the benefit of the doubt, if only to get them herself, as soon as she had the ship. Soon enough, fighting broke out nearby, but just as quickly died down again. Within minutes, she was hauled out of the makeshift cell by 2 of the white armored troopers and dragged onto a small transport ship. Just when she decided to make a run for it, pandemonium ensued, with shots ringing in the distance and cannons firing every which way. The transport took off in a hurry before the doors even started to close. They had not even cleared the height of the surrounding glaciers when the transport shook violently with an undefinable impact. In the blink of an eye, part of the hull was ripped away. The vessel began to tumble, sending the men flying into the walls and out of the opening. Zaithris gripped the security railing with all her strength, as the centrifugal force yanked her outside to follow the trajectory of the other unfortunate soldiers. Battle-honed instincts kicking in, she rotated her other arm and clasped the wrist of the trooper that had held her when he, too, was flung out of the by now uncontrollably spinning transport. A jolt of pain ripped through her as he hit the side of the vessel, causing her to scream with exertion. She was too focused on manipulating the threads of kinetic energy around her with the force in order to brace their inevitable impact to think about why she had not let go of the dead weight yet. The thought belatedly came to the forefront of her mind right before they hit the ground. Afterwards, there was only blackness. Once more, Zaithris found herself in a Republic medbay. This was turning into an obnoxious habit. The ensuing interrogation was spearheaded by a clone officer that was a novelty. Somehow she had assumed the only clone their cannon fodder, with their leadership recruited from, well, normal people. Nevertheless, it made appalling sense. The Republic cowards had created their own little military microcosm, comprised only of expendable resources, without the ordinary citizens having to dirty their hands. Perhaps the decision-makers were afraid that, when faced with the bloody reality of war, the population would discard their thin veneer of loyalty. The lives of the complacent majority lay in the hands of insignificant sentients bred exclusively for war. If they died, it did not matter. They were replaceable by design. If they won, they could be discarded anyway, thus saving the Republic the bother and bureaucracy of having to feed a standing army, or to care about the traumata they had suffered. The Republic claimed to frown upon slavery, but just how willingly did these clones jump into the proverbial Sarlacc pit, then? It was such an efficient and exceptionally cold-blooded system, Imperial strategists would have been summarily impressed by the concept. It was also quite spineless and, in a sense, the epitome of decadence. That was what you get for not having universal draft or really, any draft concept at all, it seemed. The Empire, at least, had not shied away from sending its sons and daughters to the front lines. Devotion as well as the patriotic desire to fight for the Empire until the very end had been instilled in its citizens from birth. Every man and woman had viewed it as their duty to further its reach, and to lay down their lives if necessary. That necessary more often than not had meant because a random Sith Lord could not care less was a different matter altogether, albeit a very unfortunate, reprehensible one. The current war, ingeniously dubbed the Clone War by the media, was the quintessential proxy conflict. Indoctrinated beings with neither past nor future versus mindless, program droids. Zayathrus speculated that in reality that might be the whole point. It would be delightfully ironic. Yet, how the Sith were supposedly able to manipulate both sides so thoroughly remained a mystery. As did their ultimate goal. What was the point of corrupting the Republic further and draining its resources, yet at the same time preserving its infrastructure and military capabilities? Were they simply waiting for it to fall into their lap, instead of seeking to conquer it? Yet, who in their right mind would just hand over the reins to a Sith Lord? Moreover, it would not automatically solve that irksome Jedi issue either. Interrupting her musings, a trooper unceremoniously rushed into the room and skid to a halt in front of his commanding officer. "I know her, sir," he stated, out of breath, as if he had traversed the entire length of the ship in a sprint. She was on Farna's 2. Saved a Jedi. General Kenobi allowed her to travel with him when he returned to Coruscant. His superior blinked in confusion, then turned into her direction again. "Is that true?" he intoned slowly. "Yes. Knight Vacan fearlessly rescued me from captivity. And if it hadn't been for these skilled soldiers," she nodded towards the newcomer, "we would not have made it off the planet. I am eternally grateful." She struggled to force an appreciative, grateful smile. Nox snickered in her mind. "Why don't you do the talking, then?" "Think they would appreciate the murder and mayhem speech." The officer took a deep breath and left the room with long strides, only to return moments later after making a holo call. "I am taking you to the captain." Said captain appeared to be the only person on the whole ship, apart from the former Wrath herself, not bred in an incubator. Unfortunately for everyone involved, that did not make him the most competent one. She truly just wanted to get off unimpeded at the next opportunity. But for Stanjit was he making things complicated, jabbering on about military secrets on an fracking hospital ship, from the looks of it. While she had always detested indiscriminate Sith interference in military matters, this particular officer would be in urgent need of a fist clenched around his neck for correcting his attitude. Too bad this was not the Empire after all. Their heated discussion of whether to trust her and what to do with her either way had been going round in circles for a while, when the ship dropped out of hyperspace with a sickening, jarring lurch, sending them all tumbling to the floor. Competence at work for sure. Jumping back to her feet, Zayathrus was greeted with the towering outline of a capital ship visible from the viewport. "Bloody void. Nox, aren't you my lucky charm?" The personnel scrambled to their stations just in time to bring up the shields. Unsurprisingly, in the ensuing chaos, the captain had not taken her up on her shouted offer to infiltrate the other ship and stop it from shooting them to pieces, in the absence of a more tactically sound solution. Zayathrus threw up her hands, fury rising at the sheer idiocy of trying to hold out on a medical frigate against a much larger, much better equipped ship, and left the bridge. As she jogged along the corridor without anyone having half the mind to pay attention to her, she extended her senses in search for something that might offer a way out of her predicament. One of the soldiers caught up to her, his gear setting him apart from the others she had encountered so far. "You were serious about that? What, blowing the enemy ship up?" She looked at him over her shoulder, not breaking stride. "Yeah, can you do it? If I can't, we're all doomed anyway. It's not like you have a lot of options. That's why I am here. Got no choice but to trust you." The clone briefly made eye contact, nervousness apparent, before donning his helmet in a hurry. "Is that reason enough for open insubordination?" She all but purred. "The lives of more than 1,000 vote are at stake, and all we can do is send out a handful of fighters. I am grasping at straws here, but I'd be danged if I insist on following orders right now." Perhaps these clones were not the brainwashed simpletons she had taken them for after all. "So what can you do to help me get onto that ship?" They rounded another corner, and she was beginning to wonder where exactly they were headed. "I am one of the fighter pilots supposed to buy the captain time." "For what? A stroke of genius. Something like that." "Yeah," he replied sheepishly. "No idea, actually. It's not like General Skywalker or any of the other Jedi can rush in to save the day. We're too far out." So the Jedi had a much larger involvement in this war than the anecdotal news reports indicated. "What exactly happened? Hyperdrive failure? Technical malfunction or sabotage? I don't care. Heck of a coincidence, though. Can't have been you. You were under supervision all the time. Don't seem like a separatist to me either." They reached the antechamber of a small hangar. From the looks of it, The frigate only boasted a paltry complement of starfighters. How are we going to do this? Haven't considered that far ahead. Sneak on my fighter and we'll see if we can find an opening. I do love spur-of-the-moment planning. Got a better idea? He scoffed half-heartedly. No. Anywhere is better than staying here to play sitting Nuna. Zaithras shrugged. Let's crush them. Flying was for droids, or people appreciating the technical aspects of it. Zaithras found little enjoyment in flying. All things considered, she had got used to living on a ship, but still preferred being planetside, surrounded by breathable atmosphere, and with solid ground under her boots. Compared to a Fury-class interceptor, a rather luxurious vessel by Imperial engineering standards, a starfighter was far more claustrophobia-inducing. It left her feeling completely exposed to the expanse of space and the barrage of enemy fire. The unease rising in her chest was rather unbecoming for a Sith of her stature, and Nox's perpetual teasing was not helping at all. What are you so scared of anyway? I refuse to experience fear. Who exactly was she trying to fool anyway? Refuse all you want. It's clearly not working. I can feel it. You shouldn't try to overpower everything that stands in your way. Sometimes fear is a great thing to harness. You'd be a fool to think yourself above it. Besides, we've a good chance of surviving even if this ship goes bust. How so? I'd imagine you've been through worse. Can't you endure the pain for a while? Have you considered the tissue damage from the freezing cold, the radiation and, last but not least, the zero pressure, or the lack of oxygen? Oh, oxygen is inconsequential if you have the Force. You are growing feeble. My dear Wrath, expand your horizons a little, she sighed. As long as that's the only thing that expands, well, she no doubt had the necessary abilities, but somehow, the all-encompassing void of space was quite daunting in comparison to pretty much everything she'd had to endure so far. As for the truly excruciating effects, can't be that much worse than a lightsaber wound or withstanding lightning. Think of the others who have actually kept their wrecked, mutilated bodies intact by sheer rage, which I assume should be right up your alley. Thanks for the reassurance. You know I am an optimist first and foremost. Make that a sadist. Zaithras decided to focus on the task at hand. One step at a time. Situation report. Staying clear of dogfights. Best chance is to sweep in through the aft hangar. Got to crash the ship. Though, otherwise they'll be on top of us in secs. Do it. We'll find another way off, I am sure. Breaking formation. In 3, 2, 1 now. His comm channel immediately exploded with confused requests and later expletives. Hope they won't shoot at us. Their plan was fragile enough without friendly. A misnomer if there ever was one fire. They skidded into the empty hangar just before its massive doors closed. The Republic pilots were exceptionally well trained, she had to concede. The landing had been rather fiery, but they ejected in time, their safety ensured with a little help from the Force. Hiding behind a massive support pillar, the clone surveyed their surroundings. Won't be easy, ma'am. Miss Huck Getalumesharek, Peiko Kyer. It was a somewhat far-fetched assumption, but his careless use of the word vote in regards to his fellow soldiers reinforced the impression she'd gained on the basis of the look of their armor. It was a good opportunity to honor what Torian had taught her with the utmost patience, even if she had callously sacrificed him to prioritize Vet's rescue, which, in the end, had not been successful either. It had still been one of the easiest decisions of her life, although it had complicated the Alliance's relations with their Mandalorian allies afterward somewhat. He gave an impressed huff. Ipchur Jatan Tur Ashad Kurmer. I agree. Let's get to it, then. Secure a path to the escape pods, while I'll take care of the energy core. Avoiding the droid crew was hardly a challenge. Neither was taking the patrols out of commission. Finding her way around the ship, however, was, presumably, the layout had been optimized for the droid's specific activity patterns, and not for overall efficiency. At the very least, it failed to take sentience requirements into account, who would certainly profit from a map. Another luxury she did not have, slicing was out of question as well, since she still struggled with the differences in the user interface, and, occasionally, even input method. There was no way she could do anything besides accessing the HoloNet, and even that was not a seamless experience. She would never have, though that technology would ever make her feel this stupid. Eventually, she reached the generator room. If the massive, almost palpable, energy spikes were anything to go by, they had maintained radio silence thus far, so as not to give away their presence, though by now, several droids not reporting in would probably have raised alarm anyway. At least she was finally properly armed, with a kind of reinforced electro staff she had taken from one of the more agile opponents she had encountered. Without armor, unarmed combat with droids was an extremely painful endeavor. No matter how viable a tactic for fueling her rage that was, in the long run, it was bound to give her more than horrible bruises. Faced with the obscure control panel she had been looking for, A little support from her Republic ally was in order. Still alive. Yes, ma'am. Managed to locate the escape pods. Should be quite close to your current position. Any luck so far? I am standing in the middle of the energy control room. At least I think so. Any suggestions how to reroute the energy or overload this thing? No. Thought you had a plan. I've actually never seen a generator like this. Sick. Any way to adjust the energy output? Tried that already. Probably has security algorithms in place that regulate it down again every time the input parameters are out of the normal range. The doors on both sides of the massive room open to reveal a veritable torrent of droids. Hold on. She powered up her staff and charged at her foes without hesitation. The standard type once more turned out rather frail, easy to take down in a single sweep of her unorthodox weapon. The heavily shielded ones, on the other hand, proved to be somewhat of a challenge. While dodging their fire, Zaethris ended up lifting them one by one with the force to crush their circuits from within. Whenever she managed to concentrate for long enough, or barring that, smash them into the energy core itself. An exhilarating battle, for sure, but it had taken too long. She could not afford to delay any longer. Besides, the core had not taken well to being bombarded with droids, as indicated by the warnings popping up on the panel screen, and the siren blaring overhead. That one was unmissable. She turned up some of the dials for good measure. The frequency and urgency of the warnings increased. Good sign. Kind of. Trooper, I hope you're ready to get out of here. What did you do? Solve our problem. Quite close to your position had turned out to be an overly optimistic assessment. The light freighter they had ended up commandeering when they met roughly halfway, instead was actually a tremendous improvement over an escape pod. Without haphazardly jumping to hyperspace, they might not have made it out of the blast zone of the crumbling separatist ship in time. Who could have guessed that it would explode randomly instead of breaking apart? With any luck, it had not taken the medical frigate down with it. But even in that case, the clone's sacrifice would not have been completely in vain. That line of reasoning seemed to placate the frantic pilot eventually. They spent a while in exhausted silence, watching the familiar pervasive glow of hyperspace before his curiosity apparently got the better of him. How come you speak Manda? I served alongside 2 Mandalorians back in the day. They taught me a couple of phrases. Knew it would come in handy one day. You're ex-military. Zaethris nodded vaguely. What position? Clearly a leadership role. Low-tech abilities, combat skills rivaling that of a GD general, some fancy spec ops officer. She hesitated, considering the implications of the proffered cover story, as well as imagining herself as an actual officer, before finally replying with a dark chuckle. That description comes closest. Yes, I knew it. He grinned triumphantly. Zoom owes me 20 creds now. You had a betting pool about my background, she asked with mild indignation, surprised by the clone's casual camaraderie, which indicated that they did have a mind and even a culture of their own. Yes, about lots of things actually. That came out wrong. He cleared his throat. It's not every day we have a mystery woman on our ship who nearly tore her arm out to save a brother. No one guessed the Mandalorian ties, though. You've got to work on the accent a bit, by the way. His good-natured jibe reminded her of Vet's attempts to teach her real slang. Well, boss, hate to break it to you, but it's chicken. The way you say it sounds like Charon, and that makes no sense. Would mean Death Dark or something. Not freak, but it kinda suits you. I mean, with the whole big scary Sith thing you've got going. Yeah, I'll stop. Sorry. She had not humored the Twi'lek again after that disaster. Fluency in basic as well as a functional command of both high and common Sith had been sufficient for her needs. Did you just volunteer to teach me? She stretched languidly in the seat while keeping eye contact with the pilot. Why not? Considering we've still got a couple of hours ahead of us. The corners of her lips twitched. Alternatively, there are other ways of passing time. As the suggestive words registered in his brain, the clone's eyes widened almost comically. Hey, ma'am. He unbuckled his seatbelt and all but bolted towards the rear of the ship. Got to check my gear. The woman's husky peal of laughter caught him fully off guard. You realize this might sound like an invitation to help you with your gear. He stood in the corner deliberately facing away from her, posture stiff as if standing at attention, and gave no response. You just can't help it, can you? You get all moth to the flame around these military types. Knox bristled. What's not to like? Sleek uniforms, athletic build, the desire to excel and submit to authority, an ideal combination. You don't approve. Yawn. You forgot boring and predictable. Slowly, the former wrath rose from her position and walked up to the pilot. She placed a hand on his shoulder and turned him towards her with a gentle pulling motion. No need to flee. I am not going to eat you alive. I tend to save that for the second night. The pilot caught a playful sparkle in her eyes, which in the ship's interior lighting had taken on a faint orange glow. He snorted, somewhat put at ease by her flippancy, awkwardly wondering how he could be sure that she was not serious, when she continued, "What's your name, anyway? Can't keep calling you Trooper all the time." "Yeah, that's something we should get out of way before considering other ideas. Name's Tumble." She raised a single eyebrow. "You go by your Calson." "No ma'am, we all have a designation, mine CC 1693. But apart from official contexts, we prefer our chosen names. There is something singularly empowering in naming oneself," Knox added thoughtfully. "But that particular name is unnecessarily corny. In that case, couldn't you have gone for something slightly more intimidating?" "Actually, the brothers came up with it. Tumble's already an improvement over the first version Tumbleweed. Sounds like there's an intriguing story behind that." "Oh yeah, number. Damnjit. They had dropped out of hyperspace near a small, inhabited moon. Trouble? Nah, not yet. It's just weird navigated to this outpost because it's neutral." He scowled as he double-checked his scanners. "And it's where I know for a fact are ships that happen to be in the sector dock for refueling and repairs. Looks like we missed them. At least we won't get shot at." Zaethris leaned towards the viewport to let her eyes wander over the surface. What a desolate place. Used to be a flourishing trading post before the separatist blockade of the system. Then they left, but things haven't improved for the locals again. "So, Triss, that's not my name." The pilot shrugged, unfazed. "Sounds good, though. Nice and short. My actual name sounds even better," she purred. "Especially once we get to those other activities." "This is inappropriate. You know, I get this reply a lot. Maybe because it really is." Fine, be like that." She threw her hands up in mock defeat. A nickname was actually better in case she appeared in any historical records. As unlikely as that was, considering that she had not even been able to find the names of any of Asina's successors in the woefully incomplete and watered-down Holonet history archive. Even more improbable that a clone would care to look her up. But paranoia sometimes had its advantages. "Anyway, your full name is hard to pronounce properly. Just wait until you come across Chiss names." Chiss, blue-skinned near-humans who prefer cold environments and have a convoluted social hierarchy. "You mean Panterans?" She sighed. Yet another research topic. What became of their Chiss allies? She would have expected them to disentangle themselves in time before the Empire's decline. "Never mind. I'll get drinks while you contact your high command. Requires a lot of luck to reach anyone, let alone high command. Don't think they can be bothered to pick up a lost soldier. But yeah, the earlier we get back to the GAR, the better. Meet over there, Triss." She nodded with a faint smile and headed towards a dingy little bar, before changing direction once the trooper was out of sight. Now, for the difficult part. She had little desire to board yet another Republic ship. It seemed to be an emerging pattern. Whenever she associated, however unwillingly, with the reps, getting dragged into a smoldering mess she technically could not care less about was inevitable. The small landing zone boasted an even tinier brokering area for off-world transport. The options were meager, probably based on the routes of the freighters coming in for refueling. Zaethris decided on Achora, an industrial world on the fringe of Republic space, as her next destination. It was one of the possibilities that had come up in her search for a place to base herself. With its production of cheap consumer goods, the planet was in all likelihood insignificant enough to rank low on the separatist list of targets, but still well connected, due to the high export volume. It also boasted one of the largest public libraries in the sector, hosted beneath the government building, a sensible starting point for continuing her research. For the first time since her awakening, she experienced an uneventful if rather uncomfortable flight. Zaethris missed her ship, her former crew, even more. But the thought of them produced more rage than she knew what to do with at that moment. Regardless of the strange meanderings her path had taken in the past, she had always been surrounded by people on whose personal loyalty she encouraged. Now, she just felt abandoned. The very idea was absolutely ridiculous. Alas, that did not make it any less true. As a Sith in the old Empire, her place in authority had been clear. There had been laws and implicit rules, as well as the sheer obligations of effective leadership, to shape her interactions with others. And when it came to her subordinates, she had been the law. Even more so as Alliance commander. She had had little agency in obtaining that position, just like becoming the Emperor's wrath, a fact she resented, but nevertheless endeavored to use every opportunity to become more powerful. so that she could carry out the responsibilities that came with those roles. To one day rise above these pathetic shackles of necessity and forge her own path again. Instead, she had become an insignificant speck of stardust in an unfamiliar, but just as unforgiving galaxy. The library was not as extensive as advertised. Then again, what had she expected from a backwater planet like this? But it did beat the Holonet in terms of thoroughness on the limited topics and historical periods about which it did provide documents. At least there were no other visitors around to bother her. She did not envy Nox's work during his time as head of the Sphere of Ancient Knowledge. It was unfathomable that someone, rather than die from boredom, would seek to prolong their life just to spend their time researching. We will never piece together what happened to the Empire at this rate. Not to mention finding clues as to what the Sith are currently up to. Zaithras groaned inwardly. How can you stand this? This, being in her head, Nox should not have to ask for clarification, especially considering that she did not try to mask her annoyance, so he was just being difficult. All this torturous reading, reviewing and then backtracking again. The source material did not comprise of well-ordered reports and systematic assessments that she could have tolerated. Working with Quinn had certainly left a fair amount of scars in more ways than one. Reading long-winded prose and cryptic allusions to past events made her extremely restless, which was hardly conducive to improving her concentration. She was yearning for a proper fight or, at the very least, a sparring match to relieve her tension. The meditation of transcendence, as Sana Ray had dubbed the technique the commander had learned from two of the greatest champions of the Force of her time, helped to take the edge off and allowed her to dissipate some of her cultivated rage into the Force without repercussions. Certainly an unusual, perhaps unprecedented course of action for a Sith. Nevertheless, due to the stifling, non-competitive environment, it was mentally and physically painful not to use her passions, which in turn made matters worse, because dealing with pain of course fed the dark. It was a vicious cycle. The dark side always required fuel, and if you failed to bring sufficient offerings before it, it would feast on you to sustain its ravaging flames. She had tried taking it out on criminal scum and random beasts in the wilderness, but that it only made her feel more pathetic, more angry, which again, well, there was simply no reprieve. Even her proven technique of using sex for channeling the dark power raging in her productively had begun to fail her lately. It tended to put too much strain on her already brittle self-control, and when the telltale yellow had bled into her eyes again during a tryst, deciding what to do about her casual partner afterwards had caused her a moment of hesitation. That, in its entirety, was unacceptable, dangerous, a slippery slope towards weakness, with the corruption of the light lying in wait to catch her at the end of the slow fall. She supposed she should be grateful to Mar and Satelshan for unwittingly giving her a means to preserve her sanity. Mar might still be around to hear her thanks, though he might frown upon the sorry state he would find her in. Then again, she would almost welcome him taking her out of her misery. It would be an honorable end to die at the hands of a fellow Sith, for whom she had always held a high degree of respect. Zaithras wondered what had awaited the GD Grandmaster after her eventual death. The thought of Satel's and Mars Force ghosts discussing and arguing, and who knows what else they had kept themselves each other entertained with during their exile for all eternity was highly amusing. Unfortunately for Mar, Satel was the kind of person who would serenely choose to become one with the Force, whatever that euphemism actually meant, and why someone would look forward to their identity dissolving, she still could not fathom. However, it was telling that the GD philosophy managed to portray a loss that could not be greater as a gain, turning reality on its head with their sophistry. It is such a marvelous feeling, sating one's curiosity. Knowledge is power, after all. Zaithras rolled her eyes at Nox's far too enthusiastic reply. You know, if you're so fed up, why don't you let me take the helm for a while, as in taking over my body? An icy shiver ran down her back. Is that actually a possibility? I cannot say for sure, but we won't find out unless we give it a try, will we? This arrangement is thankfully different from the one I had with my ghosts, but since it is more amicable, a temporary, consensual switch might even work. She hesitated. I can't say I like this idea. I find your lack of trust disturbing. There are quite a few people I'd rather trust not to stab me in the back while I'm defenseless, tucked in a corner of my own mind. Really? Who? Bet. Pierce. First two names required no deliberation. Probably not Lana but Theron. Which is actually kind of surprising. Quinn is a sore subject. She trailed off. A cowardly double-crossing shut up par excellence, that's what he is. And I am not on that illustrious albeit woefully short. Have you noticed? List. Her uninvited guest's tone became harsher. When have I ever hurt or betrayed you? You haven't. otherwise you'd be long dead. Technically, I am long dead, he replied dryly. Anyway, why are you worried then? Because you're self-serving chaos personified. You're precisely the kind of man who would torture a random civilian to the brink of death. Because your tea was brewed at the wrong temperature. I prefer calf, thank you. Nox snapped. You wound me, you really do. I consider you my friend, my first and only friend, truth be told. And now you tell me that he wasn't actually sobbing, was he? I mean, you never gave off any indication of your reservations, while we both still served the Empire. Or when I joined your Criffing alliance, forfeiting my chance to reclaim my seat on the council to stand by your side. At any rate, she could sense his cold fury rising. The incongruent, disembodied feeling made her nauseous. She tried to push it aside, but was met with a throbbing sting of pain. Why is that? Have you been lying to me all this time? There was a malicious, dangerous edge to his mental voice as he continued. It wasn't an issue so far, because friends are not. I had no doubt I could take you in a fight if necessary. But while you're in my head when it comes to possibly losing control over my body, I just can't afford the tables turning. It's not even personal, she ground out, bile rising in her throat as she realized that she was no longer fully in command of her motor functions. Nox, what the criffing void are you doing? There was no reply. The pain intensified, taking on a more physically manifest quality. The nerve endings in her chest and arms set ablaze. Nox, she involuntarily bent over, numb hands on the tiled floor, arms trembling, as if they could not support the weight placed on them. Struggling against the sudden crippling sensation, she threw her own rage against the incorporeal pressure. When they clashed, a white-hot storm ripped from her core to the very tips of her fingers. Streaks of lightning emanated from them, tinging the room in eerie blue, before slowly dissipating. The pungently sweet stench of burnt flesh lay in the air. Zaithris stared at the faint vein-like scorch marks branching out on the floor in disbelief, while she gasped for breath. Bloody void, she felt heady, ethereal, as if after a particularly spectacular climax or battle high. Nox's voice reappeared, somewhat quieter, more strained than before. Whoa, I certainly wasn't expecting this to happen. That was entirely unintentional, I assure you. But awesome, Criff, that felt amazing. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. You've never tried to cast lightning before? Nox asked, incredulous. Apart from during training as a team, no, did not really work for me back then. So I decided to focus on my strengths. Instead, is it supposed to hurt? Grimacing, she examined the deep crimson blisters forming on her palms. In my admittedly limited experience, he chuckled in false self-deprecation, at least not like this. But then again, you don't usually start out with this level of intensity. The upside is, that would have been more painful for your opponent than it is for you. I have never burnt myself, though. Fine, not this badly. You might want to get some practice in a more private setting. She glanced around to make sure there were no witnesses to her unexpected feat. Preferably, yes. Can't afford to burn the library down. That would be a category of fuber I am not willing to deal with right now. She drew another shaky breath and rose from her knees. I'll get some Kolto or Bacta, as it's called nowadays, for my hands. Good idea. I will get some rest in the meantime. Rest? Why would you need to rest? Turns out this wonderful little accident was quite draining. So to reiterate, even if I wanted to, I couldn't keep a hold over you for long anyway. Talking to you is taxing enough. Controlling your body is bound to be exceptionally exhausting. Zaithris made a half-hearted attempt to cover up the damage they had caused to the floor. Wrath. You haven't answered my question. What Kess, are you serious? You of all people worrying about. She pulled the low reading table over the scorched spot with more force than necessary and straightened. Call our relationship what you want. We have always got along remarkably well, all things considered. Don't let it get to your head, though. Most of the government building was open to the public, apparently in order to give the impression that the Achoran leaders took their citizens seriously. The hallways, like the wide, empty avenues outside, were plastered with gaudy yellow on magenta banners, proclaiming the power and solidarity of the people with jarring slogans. Zaithris made her way up to a viewing platform to catch some fresh air, after getting her hands treated by the resident med droid for free. It was adamant about that perk, repeating it incessantly. Apparently some kind of new policy that needed to be shoved into people's faces. The bandages were soaked with a cooling tincture that was clearly not Bacta, and smelled vaguely of tree resin, and Teresian rose. Pleasant, but most likely not the pinnacle of effectivity. No wonder the treatment was free. She leaned over the balcony railing and watched the cityscape below. Dressed in almost identical simple tunics, most citizens walked at a brisk pace, rarely stopping for social niceties. From what she had gathered during the few rotations spent on Achora, most inhabitants were laborers and factory employees, with long working hours approaching almost 2/3 of a rotation. There was no nightlife to speak of and, correspondingly, no criminal scene. The government regulated all aspects of life even more than the empire, which had emphasized individual freedom within the confines of one's status, as long as it did not override one's duty, ostensibly for the benefit of the people, a fact proudly proclaimed by the ubiquitous banners. Off-worlders were mostly left alone, but were required to stay at special cultural exchange hostels, an ironic term, considering that there was little indication that the natives had any willingness or, more notably, any time to spare for cultural activities. Zaithras wondered whether the people had actually any say here, and would choose such a highly regulated life, which appeared to be driven not by duty or efficiency but sugar-coated necessity, the propaganda pointing to a high degree of cognitive dissonance. Nevertheless, there was no visible poverty. Basic pillars of society like healthcare or education seemed to be free of charge as well. Overall, the average citizen led a hollow life without any overarching goal. Free from both worries and meaning, fiery slogans notwithstanding, might as well be droids. Something shrill whined in the disconcertingly clockwork-like ebb and flow of the Force. It was a sudden change, quiet, but nearby. Zaithras sensed no actual threat or even significance to herself, but curiosity won over. She headed towards the elevator to investigate. The control panel was dead. After a few moments of patiently waiting, the planet was rubbing off on her. It seemed she pushed the sliding doors open with the force. The elevator was stuck at the lowest position, but there was nothing stopping her from dropping down a few levels. Admittedly, using the service ladder would have been the obvious option intended by the planner. Too trivial. Her senses had not misled her. That assessment was ambiguous. However, as her exploration ended abruptly in front of the muzzle of a blaster carbine, 4 to be exact, wielded by ugly miscreants, not locals, that much was clear. Top-of-the-line weapons, but dressed like a newly formed gang of backstreet thugs. Their appearance was not that of the typical hired gun. "What have we got here?" A masked alien grunted, possibly a Rhodian from the stature. Shriek criffed up big time. "Should have cleared everyone out. Let's rub it into his face. Get the girl and move it." Another barked excitedly. Zaithras decided to humor them by complying when they roughly pushed her further down the hallway. They had signed their death warrant anyway, but could still be of use or at least give away their associates, which meant more easy prey for her, perhaps even an actually challenging opponent. It was worth the wait and momentary discomfort. Besides, armed off-worlders infiltrating the government building was such a gross anomaly, especially on this planet, that it merited examining. One of the men touched his earpiece, and after a few seconds, declared ominously, "Got him. Let's kill the little coward." There was little doubt whom they were after, or rather, where their intended victim had holed up. The fear emanating from one of the rooms in front of them was palpable. Apparently, they had decided in that moment to get rid of their presumed liability instead, as one of the men proceeded to shove her brutally into a corner and raise his blaster towards her head. Fools. Zaithras caught the weapon in mid-motion, flipped it around and pulled the trigger with the force, which due to the short distance, melted off a substantial chunk of the Duro's face. Using the stunned surprise of the other criminals to her advantage, she slammed her full weight into the nearest opponent, who dropped unconscious on impact. The remaining 2 regained their resolve quickly, but while one managed to fire a few easily dodged shots, she spun around and lifted the other one, a heavily armored Zabrak, with the force, and flung him into his comrade. The latter fell with a yelp that was followed by a faint snap as a kick found its target, his exposed neck. Without releasing her hold, she closed her fist and yanked out the Zabrak's trachea, which resulted in a gushing spray of blood. The purplish-red color clashed violently with the general color scheme of the building. The former Wrath took a step back as her victim slid down the wall. She did not flinch when a single shot disrupted the silence that had fallen over the hallway. Without looking up, she allowed her lips to twist into a vicious, knowing smile as she reached into the force, creating a conduit for the rest of her fury to counteract the effects the brief combat had undoubtedly had on her features. "Good shot," she praised the young man who was breathing heavily. eyes wide as he took in the gruesome scene. Blaster pistol trained and trembling hands at her head. Military, but not local, judging from his uniform. Didn't think he'd be getting up anytime soon. A lie, of course. But there was no harm in stoking the young officer's ego a little. The rank insignia indicated that he was a lieutenant, coupled with the young age and nervous demeanor. It was safe to say that he probably had not seen much action yet. Oh, stars. He gulped. Who are you with them? She held her hands up in a placating gesture and slowly walked towards him, stepping over the fallen form of one of the thugs indifferently. I mean you no harm. I'm just a visitor, got trapped on the observatory above. Who are they? That's the better question. Terrorists, I think. They interrupted a government assembly and took practically the whole Achoran leadership as hostages. He replied with no small amount of caution. Impressive. That requires more coordination than I assumed them capable of. Why were they after you? Then, I tried to stop them to circumvent the lockdown. Are you alone? You've obviously no mere civilian. Why don't you stop threatening me with your blaster first? Nerves, Lieutenant. One day, your anxiety is going to be the death of you. As if on cue, the officer exhaled shakily in an unsuccessful attempt to calm himself. Besides, you've just showcased your superb reflexes while I am unarmed and still managed to take these 4 assailants out. Quite gruesomely at that he trailed off, gaze fixed on the pool of blood forming of the polished floor behind the woman. Luckily for you, I should say. Otherwise we'd both be dead by now. Lucky indeed. He gradually lowered the blaster. Fine, come in. The decryption routine should finish by now. Will you help me stop them? Zaithras followed him into a dark, cramped room that looked like a security monitoring hub and blocked the entrance again with a desk. Sure. Just how are you going to accomplish that from this hideout? Sliced into the mainframe, trying to get cameras or audio on them, working on finding a loophole to exploit. His fingers flitted over the controls as he spoke. Alas, no security droids in this place. Intelligence. Huh. Your day job, frankly speaking. You don't seem cut out to be a field agent, though? Oh. He gave a bashful, boyish grin. You are correct. That would have been a most unwise career choice for me. Regular military then. Which division? Engineering Corps. Figures. She slowly raked her eyes over his slim form. That was flattered by the midnight blue service uniform. I dare say this is hardly the time for nerd jokes, ma'am. A smudge of resentment tinged his deadpan reply. Actually, that was supposed to be a compliment in regards to your competence. Ah, well, I don't get that very often. Compliments. He paused awkwardly, a blush creeping onto his pale cheeks. Lieutenant Phelan Mitaka. He briefly made eye contact as he introduced himself before going back to concentrating intently on the script commands running over the screen. A pleasure. Knox gave a fake sigh. Not this again. You're just jealous about the prospect of you getting it on with that mousy, completely unremarkable lieutenant. A Republic one at that. Yet another pallid face with dark hair that triggers your uniform fetish. You must be really desperate. Wrath. Might I recommend a cold shower instead? Never mind my preferences, though, I won't stand in your way. As if. Heh. Besides, I'll surely find some memories to keep me entertained in the meantime. You know what? I am going to help you get a body just so I can give you the slowest, most excruciating death imaginable. She sneered. See, that's the spirit, my dear. Knox chuckled. Zaithras turned towards another screen to keep the officer from seeing her annoyed scowl. I should have left you to rot in that tomb on Korriban. Perhaps. He hummed, reminiscing. Perhaps you should have. No mercy for the weak and all that. Right. I always wondered why you didn't just put me out of my misery on the spot. You seemed useful. For what precisely? Serving as chlor-slit fodder and ill-timed discussions. Before they could continue their banter, a faint cough brought her out of her thoughts. Ma'am. Mitaka looked at her with an expectant look on his face. I got the first cameras working. She leaned closely over his shoulder to get a better viewing angle of the screen. A gesture that made the lieutenant flinch. He visibly struggled to regain his focus. For once, she chose to ignore the delightful weakness displayed as another camera feed flickering to life caught her attention. Which levels are the infiltrators located on? This one and the 2 floors above us. The hostages are in the president's office 1 level up. The government building is seriously understaffed, so the attackers met little resistance when they put the entire facility on lockdown, and local forces are not exactly up to the task. Why is that? There was a political revolution a few months ago, which brought a hitherto minority faction into office. Achora has been a member of the Republic for about 200 standard years, before which they were a Hutt colony for a brief time. Recently, tensions have risen, but instead of joining the separatists, the Will of the People movement gained momentum. A curious development, Knox remarked. What makes you say that? The factories. The local economy relies on mass production. By emphasizing self-sufficiency, they've declared to move away from the Republic. as is evident from the slogans, but without either them or the separatists as customers, the Achoran economy will simply crumble. On top of that, these people are hardly the revolutionary type, are they? Is that revolution why you came to Achora? What? No, I was here for a proposal of a joint research undertaking, which of course isn't facilitated by the increasing wariness towards the Republic. I hid here when, soon after my meeting partners not showing up, the lockdown took effect. Zayathris sensed that his statement was true enough, but obfuscated a deeper significance. She did not press the issue. The man was far too guileless for outright deception, and seemed sincere in his desire to stop the alleged terrorists. "I'm in," Mitaka suddenly exclaimed in triumph, but his expression faltered instantly. "It's worse than I assumed. No visual on the hostages possible and more aggressors than expected. Nothing I cannot handle. You can't just rush in, can't I? They'll be dead before they know what's happening. I admit I am less worried about you than about the politicians. Have there been any demands, any communication by their captors? None that I am aware of, but I wonder what channels they could possibly go through anyway. So it stands to reason that they either simply want to wreak havoc, which bodes poorly for the hostages anyway, or are directly pressuring the politicians present into changing their decisions on something. In the latter case, they won't kill them no matter what is going on outside. That sounds plausible. They likely know something happened, their cronies, and they are aware of your presence. I'm sure they don't expect you to have backup, so if we move quickly enough, we can take out their patrols. The main group won't have time to prioritize whom to keep alive as leverage." Mitaka nodded hesitantly. "Tell me, Lieutenant, are there medical droids on the uppermost level?" "Let me check. Yes, there is one, at the far end of the corridor. These droids use Laren acid as a wound disinfectant. Undiluted, it tends to be quite explosive. Overload the droid and you've got an improvised bomb." "How do you never mind? Their patrols are moving towards the elevator shaft. The time to act is now." "Good, prepare the droid. I'll be back in a moment." She ducked out of the room to search the bodies outside for weapons, settling on a stun baton and 2 grenades of unidentifiable effect. She returned to check on Mitaka's progress with the droid. His gaze darted to her hands. "That must be agonizing." Frowning, Zayathris turned her palms up. The bandages were coming loose, and most of the blisters had ruptured during the fight, oozing liquid. "How can you even bear to hold that weapon?" "Willpower. Have you finished the preparations?" She replied in a detached manner. "Don't concern yourself with me. I can handle it." "Are you sure?" Zayathris shot him a withering look. "All right. I'll just assume you know what you're doing." Expression still worried, Mitaka tossed her a comm earpiece. "I'm ready. They won't know what hit them." After accessing the next level, she pressed herself into an alcove to contact the lieutenant. "How many targets?" 6-4 coming towards you, 2 guarding the entrance." "Good. Trigger the droid on my signal. Now disable the camera feed for this level." "What? Why? I won't be able to help you." "Don't question me. Let's assume I outrank you by a fair bit. Technically even true." "Criff." Mitaka seemed to take the bait. "I mean, confirmed, ma'am. Just a visitor." "Right." Zayathris ripped through the patrol with little effort, while the unfortunate med droid had the honor of doing the same 1 level up, with the convenient addition of destroying part of the floor above the antechamber of the government office, where the hostages were held, which maximized the confusion. Making a show of clumsily trying to overpower one of the guards, she then allowed the infiltrators to take her captive. As expected, with their numbers literally decimated, they could not afford to remain spread out, and brought her to the main office, ordering her to join the hostages kneeling in the far end of the large elliptical room. Her captors had failed to notice the concussion grenades rolling behind them. Seconds after the safety was pulled out, the shockwaves ripped through the room, instantly killing the thugs standing nearby, and sending the others crumbling to the floor. Zayathris absorbed the brunt of the blast, shielding the hostages from most of the explosive power and secondary shrapnel. The exertion left her dazed. Defensive measures had not featured prominently in her training, nor were they part of her general fighting style, but working with her crew had forced her to learn the basic techniques. The taste of copper and sulfur filled her mouth as her surroundings blurred in waves, her field of vision tinged crimson, and narrowed to a small tunnel. As she attempted to clear the mental fog, the realization slowly set in that she was not the only one still standing. The leader of the aggressors was swaying, blood running down his face in a multitude of tiny rivulets. There was a triggering device in his hand that he held up vengefully. She hesitated, unable to tell if it had a dead man's switch or regular trigger, which meant whatever was connected to the device was just as likely to go off whether she interfered or not. No hints from the Force, either. The man started backing out of the room, his mouth twisted in a furious, bloodstained sneer that showed all front teeth missing. As he stepped over the threshold, Zaithras sensed his resolve, set ablaze by the desire for retribution. Time slowed to a crawl when his finger twitched. Instinctively, she threw out her hands to yank the device away and, with a terrifying scream, sent the assailant crashing into the pile of debris behind him, his body bending over backwards in an utterly unnatural angle. The explosion never came. Gradually, the ringing in her ears subsided, allowing Mitaka's distorted transmission to reach her. What status? Copy. All terrorists eliminated, but not over yet. Her voice sounded hoarse. Place is rigged. I say again. There is a bomb. Not sure if the triggering device. Quite confident the bomb cannot activate it at the moment. There was a brief pause, and then the communication quality improved. Ah, that's the one they used. I picked up a regular signal earlier, so continually broadcasted noise all over the area, which interferes with the most common frequencies for remote connections, since the explosive is fortunately not volatile enough to be triggered by a grenade blast. I think there was no danger at all. Information flow, Lieutenant. That would have been helpful to know. She spat. That was too close for my liking. I apologize, ma'am. Tactically, it made little sense to. Stop groveling. She cut him off sharply and turned towards the politicians who supported each other, as they made hesitant attempts to get up. Some had mild injuries, but nothing even the improvised treatments the local droids were offering could not heal. You are safe now. I'd advise having a bomb squad take a thorough look at the building, though. You owe your rescue to Lieutenant Phelan Mitaka of the Republic. No, the honor belongs to you. I didn't. The officer promptly launched into a panicked stream of clarifications. Can't hurt to be well in with these people. Considering your project proposal, it might even expedite your promotion. She wrenched out the earpiece before the taken-aback lieutenant could argue further, and crushed it under her boot. Have a nice day, gentlings. She gave a mock bow and backed out of the room, vanishing out of sight through the damaged ceiling. As fun as that had been, it was time to leave while she still could. If she believed in the concept of the Force exhibiting agency or even an explicit will, it would certainly seem was as if the Force was determined to throw distractions at her to keep her from learning enough about the current state of the galaxy to piece together the seemingly incongruous threads and uncover the role of the Sith in it. Conversely, had each detour not also represented a major opportunity? Was there any other option to jumping headlong into every chance at combat? However loath she was to continue inadvertently aiding the Republic or extending help from the non-existent goodness of her heart in general, not acting was just as wrong. It would deprive her of the thrills as well as existential necessity of battle, and instead lead her to adopt the jaded apathy of the Jedi. Ultimately, the only alternative consisted in stagnation, the very antithesis of power. If she kept a couple of undeserving weaklings alive along the way, it actually wasn't her problem. As long as she got something out of the overall situation. They might be poor, inefficient choices, but without an intrinsic understanding of the workings of the world she had been thrown into. She was fumbling in the dark regardless. Allowing flaws to fester was a surefire way to erode a society, and these weren't her people. She could do what she well dang pleased. Who was to stop her? Besides, even those actions of hers that could be construed as philanthropic tended to leave a pile of corpses in their wake. So it evened itself out in the end. She had almost made to the spaceport when a young woman, who had braved the uniform masses walking home from work, called from behind her, "Please don't leave." Puzzled by the sudden disturbance, Zaithras turned around and waited for her to approach. "Forgive the intrusion, milady. The president wishes to speak to you." An annoyed scowl creased the former Wrath's forehead. "I have no desire to get involved in local politics, but you already have, and that's as far as I will go," she asserted. The messenger's crestfallen expression was quickly replaced by a faint, sly smirk. "I don't not recall the Office of Off-World Relations issuing a departure voucher recently." Zaithras stopped in her tracks again. "I apologize for the hassle our regulations creates for you, but proper procedure must be followed." "Well played, of course. I would not want to get in the way of your bureaucracy." She made a deferential gesture to the girl. "Lead the way," because, of course, things could not be straightforward for once. The meeting took place in the Minor Hall of the People, a smaller building adjacent to the main government building. The young aide scurried out of the unadorned room after bringing them a tray of tea and a small plate of what looked like crystallized flowers. "Zanathi Garage." The wiry, elderly woman introduced herself cordially as she took a seat on a low chair. There was a bandage on her neck, which filled the room with the familiar smell of resin. "It is my responsibility to embody and carry out the will of the Achoran people. It is an honor, Your Highness." Admittedly, Zaithras had not given the protocol followed in Republic space much thought. Military and Sith conventions were instilled from birth, and if any Republic Alliance member had taken issue with being addressed in the same way their Imperial equivalents were, or simply as GD. They had not addressed it, at least to her face. On the other hand, it had never mattered how she addressed her foes. Nevertheless, needlessly antagonizing the local leadership would not get her the permit she needed to leave. The minor issue of decorum was moot, as the president gave her an encouraging nod and waved her concerns aside. Do not burden yourself with formalities. I am but the first among equals. No citizen on this planet may boast to be more important than his or her peers. What is your name? Triss, she replied curtly. Not even her own parents had called her by such a nickname. She tried to tell herself that adopting it as a makeshift nom de guerre was for the best. But she still could not shake off the derogatory connotation, even if it existed solely in her mind. You birth planet must have a curious naming convention, Garage remarked shrewdly, but it matters not. The poor Lieutenant Mitaka tried very hard to protect your identity and details of your involvement. His performance, however, led us to the conclusion that he in fact does not know who you are. I am puzzled as to why you would risk your life for complete strangers on a planet in whose future you have no stake, only to disappear as soon as the threat was eliminated. Please sate my idle curiosity. I killed those thugs because they attacked me, nothing more. Not seeing this path through to its logical conclusion would not have had any advantages for me either. Dishonesty would not benefit her here. Gratitude is not a currency. Besides, any actual compensation you could offer me is likely taken from the pockets of hard-working people who can't even afford Bacta. So what would I want stay for? The president's brows furrowed in bemusement. Are you a supporter of the revolution, then? While the self-empowerment of a people is an admirable goal, I am afraid that such movements are of little importance to me. What is of importance to you? Making sense of a galaxy that is spinning contrary to what one would expect. What, for example, were your captors after? The older woman peered over the rim of her glasses. You are asking the right questions. How familiar are you with the purpose of the revolution? I could quote some of those slogans outside, but other than that, you will have to elucidate me. Achora has a troubled history. There has been not a single period of peace and growth lasting longer than a few generations. Our ancestors, desperate to ally with any power that promised protection and business, threw in their lot with any faction imaginable. Warlords in this sector, trade associations, legend has it, even the Sith Empire and such ilk before Ruisan. All conjecture, obviously, considering how much knowledge was lost in every major upheaval. Our culture values compliance and respect for our elders, so no one dared to go against such an ill-fated strategy. 2 centuries ago, the Republic found us, drained of resources and qualified workers by the Hutt cartel. Within years, our factories flourished once more, yet at what price? Our environment is almost as polluted as the Coruscanti Undercity. Our people spent the majority of their lifetime manufacturing cheap, pointless goods that wealthy people in the core thoughtlessly buy and throw away after a few uses. What kind of existence is that? Why should we swear fealty to a republic that merely seeks to exploit us, to waste the lives of our sons and daughters on menial tasks that serve only to further decadence? Have the separatists offered you the opportunity to join them? Garage gave a bark of mirthless laughter. With them, it's never an offer, but outright coercion. And that's what you witnessed today. The separatists sent a transmission many rotations ago, promising us a bright future as producers of droid parts and armor components. We never replied as we were caught up in the aftershocks of the revolution. They do not take kindly to being ignored. Other planets were invaded, but we are probably not important enough. After all, we get the brute lowlifes that ask us to join at gunpoint. They were prepared to take out the entire leadership in case of your refusal, of course, in the hopes of halting the progress of our movement. But we would have died knowing that others will carry forth the flame. The revolution is inevitable, so the Republic is unable to protect you in this war, correct? However, that phrasing implies that they would want to. In fact, the Republic has overextended itself already. It is in its death throes. It is our assessment that the ongoing war has driven the Republic far beyond the brink of bankruptcy. Even if the hostilities were to end this very instant, the Republic would still be unable to pay off the debts, fulfill the contracts with the heavy industry, and keep sustaining a standing army. The alternative to the latter, of course, amounts to genocide. Zaethris suggested with careful neutrality. Harsh but true. The separatists at least do not have that particular problem. Furthermore, should the bankers waive all obligations, an impossible scenario, of course the Republic would be pulled under by reparation demands from neutral systems, and the costs of reconstructing their own infrastructure. Tell me, have you been to Coruscant? Zaethris shook her head. Her grandfather had died there, serving as head of engineering on one of the Imperial warships down during the sacking of Coruscant. But that hardly qualified. Well, I have. Corruption is rampant on every level, From the lowest cesspit in the works to the Senate floor. Which probably does not come as a surprise, the lower districts of city have always been less affluent. She made a face of disgust at the euphemism, with all the unfortunate developments that come in tandem with that. But the war has made life hardly bearable. People struggle to afford the most basic necessities. And that's the situation in the very heart of the Republic. Think of what this means for all the systems beyond the core that do not happen to profit from the war. For a world like yours, siding with the Republic seems like suicide either way. That is the very point. We must go our own way. We have no need for any galactic umbrella treaties that favor the rich and discard the poor. This dynamic is almost a natural law if we continue to accept the dominance of the markets and banks. That this war started over a trade dispute is very telling. There is only one thing about which we might find some common ground with the separatists. The whole system is broken. It cannot be reformed, but we want no part in it, at all. The president placed a candied petal in the tea, and took a sip of the lilac-colored beverage, encouraging Zaithris to do the same. Please help yourself. What are your views on the war? So far, I have not been personally affected by it, aside from stumbling into it wherever she went, but she had not lost anything due to this particular war. It might be a result of the broken system, as you call it. Hypocrisy, in my experience, is fairly typical for the Republic, yet I cannot shake the thought that there is more to this than meets the eye. I have little insight into either Republic or Separatist matters, so I am unable to give a more exhaustive analysis. Good, then you will be able to approach my proposition with an open mind. That was unexpected. I am listening. It has come to our attention that the Republic is employing various means of obtaining the few natural resources we have left. Your lieutenant is involved in one such attempt, this time for research purposes. Oddly enough, similar requests have gone through other, superficially neutral channels that we ultimately trace to the separatists. We need someone to investigate this alarming coincidence. Why me? What makes you trust me? The heroine of the Forward Sanctuary X, they call you. Zaithris gave an undignified snort. You cannot be serious. It is all over the holonet. The president shrugged apologetically, implying they both knew how reliable that source was. Obvious propaganda to give this war a more approachable, non-military face. But your feat still stands. That much is verifiable. Other members of my staff have theorized that you might be a GD. Not a single member of their order has deigned to visit Achora in centuries. However, why now? I prefer to believe what I see. And that is not the meekness typically associated with their religion. Zaithris tensed and set down the cup of tea. Was Garage suggesting that she knew more about her background? Do not be alarmed. I do not disapprove of your methods. Coupled with the skills and fearlessness you have demonstrated today, you are an ideal candidate. Our society has always been very passive, chained down by tradition and compliance. Conformity, certainly a useful trait while coordinating a revolution, stifles initiative. Someone, an outsider, might provide fresh insights and the ability to act where we can't. The attack could have been a decoy operation. I could be a spy. There was no way the president had not considered this caveat. You could, yet, considering your reluctance to interact with me in the first place, I believe the odds are in my favor. Someone who actually wants to work for us would be much riskier. Garage stood up and walked over to the holo terminal in the corner, before continuing. We can't offer you much, but the position does come with the usage of a ship and a simple apartment on Coruscant. Enticing. Imprudent. I accept your proposal. The older woman turned around, a knowing smirk flitting across her lips. Once more, the people of Achora are indebted to you. I shall put you in contact with our representative in the Senate, Ptolemid Iskra. Coruscant was one of the last places Zaithris had expected to set foot on during her lifetime. Admittedly, she might have thought the same thing about Tython once. She had been born a decade before the treaty and barely remembered the pictures of the glorious assault on the Republic capital. But she vividly remembered the pride she had felt. The Ray's temple burning, the unyielding patrols on the streets, the humiliated dignitaries kneeling before Imperial troops. Later Theron's descriptions of his home planet had added another differently biased facet to her mental image of Coruscant. 4 millennia were a long time for the face of the planet to change. It was not what she had expected at all. Whereas Korriban had been sand and ashes, whereas Draman Kaz had been ozone and mud, the megalopolis reeked of silicone oil, spice and cloying perfume. From the uncountable vehicles crisscrossing overhead to the engineering marvels that kept it running, The capital was a chaotic mesh of layers, its erratic pulse beating unbearably fast. It dictated the harsh rhythm the people rushing by fell in step with. Garish adverts promised entertainment for all tastes. From above, the cityscape gave an orderly impression, certain buildings protruding like beacons for the citizens to crowd around and worship the mindless pursuit of luxury and consumerism. The streets spreading from the monumental Senate building to the districts housing mainly media corporations and shopping malls were clean, safe and alluring. As long as one did not look down, these observations were but superficial. Looking beyond the imposing architecture with its gleaming surfaces revealed a truly rotten world. The very idea of a significant GD presence here was ludicrous. In fact, their collective aura was muted to the point of being impossible to perceive unless you specifically looked for it. Tython had emanated a profoundly terrifying atmosphere. It was like staring into the open maw of the Force, only to see your own death at the end of a blindingly bright tunnel staring back at you. And it was laughing at your folly. Facing one's mortality should not come as a shock, especially to a Sith. Confrontations with death were daily business, but it was the way it made her feel completely powerless and insignificant. With regards to manifestations of the Force, only witnessing Vitiate's obliteration of Zeist had been worse, although for rather different reasons. Tython represented everything unnatural and hypocritical. The GD stood for detachment, suppression of emotions, apathy. Coruscant was not similar in any way. It was alive, very much so, but in a parasitic way. The searing excitement of drunkenly dancing and freaking above the hastily dug graves of your fallen comrades because you too might be dead by tomorrow. After us, the deluge, as one might put it. In contrast, billions huddled together in despair formed the underbelly, the very foundation of the capital. Built on lies, durasteel beams and bones, it attacked the senses with incessant cries and small pops of lives extinguished in misery, echoing through the Force. Even in the quietest moments, there was no solace to be found like the ominous cracks of a frozen lake, on which you have set up camp haunting you in your sleep. The city was war. Zathras relished it. To see the sanctimonious republic digging its own grave, the mask of magnanimity ripped away. All of these considerations faded into the background in comparison to the shroud of darkness blanketing the whole planet. The deeply unsettling character of this phenomenon was impossible to put into coherent thoughts. The only meaningful analogy that one could make was the Dark Temple on Dramenkaz, a twisted, dark microcosm on an already dark planet. That the hedonistic impulses and careless lifestyle as well as the suffering and resentment festering below invited the dark was the nature of things. Only, this particular phenomenon was not natural. There was little doubt that it had not developed organically. Thus it was not merely the result of the constant influence of a nexus in the Force either. Whether it had been Zeist or Korriban, where even the flora and fauna had developed in tandem with the influence of the divergences spreading over the planets, the Dark had always welcomed her with open arms. Currently, it was more of a resentful tolerance. Within the darkness, a faint light stood, flickering in the Force like dying embers. To see the GD temple bustling with activity of frantic activity, akin to the thrashing of someone suffocating amongst the threads of this pervasive fabric, was utterly puzzling. Zathras being highly attuned to the dark, the constant sensation did not bother her in the slightest. Instead, it was invigorating, despite it feeling rather out of place. However, for the GD, it had to be a persistent, throbbing disturbance. The shroud was not so dense as to cause obvious physical discomfort or even pain. Yet the effect it must have on them was undeniable. Why the GD had not withdrawn from Coruscant long ago boggled the mind. They could probably get used to it. The way you can tune out the anguished cries of a torture victim, you can keep them from chipping away at your principles, but should not claim to be able to concentrate properly. Unless you thrive on such a thing, that is, then it was probably the sweetest, most vitalizing symphony imaginable. She resolved to ask Nox about his feelings in that regard. It was bound to be an interesting discussion for the GD to remain on Coruscant. In fact, using it as their main base of operations and teaching it was absolute madness. There were other facilities spread across the galaxy. She had read mentions of one on Bandamir. Why not relocate? Hubris. Some kind of sick test of resolve and resilience to the dark for the GD in training. Then again, this constant exposure probably did little to build resilience as opposed to numbing their senses. That would play nicely into the hands of the Sith, allowing them to operate concealed by the shadows, as they could blend effortlessly into the background hum. On the other hand, to create such a phenomenon in the first place, well, Everything was possible with enough power, but at what cost? The war, vitiated, played both sides, the Empire and Republic, mere pawns to be sacrificed, rather manipulated into eviscerating each other in his quest for immortality. These modern Sith were employing the same method. There was not going to be an invasion from the outside. They were already here, in the very heart of the Republic. The Jedi would not stand a chance.